Section 25 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, Part 2, The Electric Creed. Let us now take the creed as accepted today by the Christian Church, and see how thoroughly it harmonizes with the discoveries of spiritual electricity. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. This is a brief and simple description of the Creator as He exists, a supreme center of light, out of whom must spring all life, all love, all wisdom. And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages. This means that the only absolute emanation of His own personal radiance that ever wore such mean garb as our clay was found in Christ, who, as part of God, certainly existed before all ages, for as the creed itself says, He was God of God, light of light. Then we go on through the circumstances of Christ's birth, life, death, and resurrection, and our profession of faith brings us to I believe in the Holy Ghost, the Lord and giver of life, who proceedeth from the Father and the Son, etc. This, as already stated, means that we believe that since Christ ascended into heaven, our electric communication with the Creator has been established, and an ever-flowing current of divine inspiration is turned beneficially in the direction of our earth, proceeding from the Father and the Son. We admit in the Creed that this inspiration manifested itself before Christ came and spake by the prophets, but as before stated, this only happened at rare and difficult intervals, while now Christ Himself speaks through those who most strongly adhere to His teachings. It may here be mentioned that few seem to grasp the fact of the special message to women intended to be conveyed in the person of the Virgin Mary. She was actually one of the radiant spirits of the central sphere, imprisoned by God's will in woman's form. After the birth of Christ, she was still kept on earth to follow His career to the end. There was a secret understanding between Himself and her, as for instance, when she found Him among the doctors of the law, she for one moment suffered her humanity to get the better of her in anxious inquiries, and His reply, "Why sought ye me? Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business?" was a sort of reminder to her, which she at once accepted. Again, at the marriage feast in Cana of Galilee, when Christ turned the water into wine, He said to His mother, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" which meant simply, "What have I to do with thee as woman merely?" which was another reminder to her of her spiritual origin, causing her at once to address the servants who stood by as follows: "Whatsoever He saith unto you, do it." And why, it may be asked, if Mary was really an imprisoned immortal spirit, sinless and joyous, should she be forced to suffer all the weaknesses, sorrows, and anxieties of any ordinary woman and mother, simply as an example to women who are the mothers of the human race, and who, being thus laid under a heavy responsibility, need sympathetic guidance? Mary's life teaches women that the virtues they need are obedience, purity, meekness, patience, long-suffering, modesty, self-denial, and endurance. She loved to hold a secondary position. She placed herself in willing subjection to Joseph, a man of austere and simple life, advanced in years, and weighted with the cares of a family by a previous marriage, who wedded her by an influence which compelled him to become her protector in the eyes of the world. Out of these facts, simple as they are, can be drawn the secret of happiness for women, a secret and a lesson that, if learnt by heart, would bring them and those they love out of storm and bewilderment into peace and safety. For those who have once become aware of the existence of the central sphere and of the electric rings surrounding it, and who are able to realize to the full the gigantic as well as minute work performed by the electric waves around us and within us, there can no longer be any doubt as to all the facts of Christianity, as none of them, viewed by the electric theory, are otherwise than in accordance with the Creator's love and sympathy with even the smallest portion of His creation. Why, then, if Christianity be a divine truth, are not all people Christians? As well ask, if music and poetry are good things, why all men are not poets and musicians? Art seeks art, In like manner God seeks God, that is, he seeks portions of his own essence among his creatures. Christ himself said, "Many are called, but few are chosen," and it stands to reason that very few souls will succeed in becoming pure enough to enter the central sphere without hindrance. Many, on leaving earth, will be detained in the purgatory of air, where thousands of spirits work for ages, watching over others, helping and warning others, and in this unselfish labor succeed in raising themselves, little by little, higher and ever higher, till they at last reach the longed for goal. It must also be remembered that not only from earth, but from all worlds, released souls seek to attain final happiness in the central sphere where God is, so that, however great the number of those that are permitted to proceed thither from this little planet, they can only form, as it were, one drop in a mighty ocean. It has been asked whether the electric theory of Christianity includes the doctrine of hell, or a place of perpetual punishment. Eternal punishment is merely a form of speech for what is really eternal retrogression. For as there is a forward, so there must be a backward. The electric germ of the soul, delicate, fiery, and imperishable as it is, can be forced by its companion will to take refuge in a lower form of material existence, dependent on the body it first inhabits. For instance, a man who is obstinate in pursuing active evil can so retrograde the progress of any spiritual life within him that it shall lack the power to escape, as it might do from merely lymphatic and listless temperaments, to seek some other chance of development, but shall sink into the form of quadrupeds, birds, and other creatures, dominated by purely physical needs. But there's one thing it can never escape from: memory, and in that faculty is constituted hell. So that if a man by choice forces his soul downward to inhabit hereafter the bodies of dogs, horses, and other like animals, he should know that he does so at the cost of everything except remembrance. Eternal retrogression means that the hopelessly tainted electric germ recoils further and further from the pure centre whence it sprang, always bearing within itself the knowledge of what it was once and what it might have been. There is a pathetic meaning in the eyes of a dog or a seal, in the melancholy, patient gaze of the oxen toiling at the plough. There is an unuttered warning in the silent faces of flowers. There is more tenderness of regret in the voice of the nightingale than love, and in the wild upward soaring of the lark, with its throat full of passionate shouting prayer, there is shadowed forth the yearning hope that dies away in despair as the bird sinks to earth again, his instincts not half satisfied. There is no greater torture than to be compelled to remember in suffering joys and glorious opportunities gone forever. Regarding the electric theory of religion, it is curious to observe how the truth of it has again and again been dimly shadowed forth in the prophecies of art, science, and poesy. The old painters who depicted a halo of light round the head of their virgins and saints did so out of a correct impulse which they did not hesitate to obey. [Footnote: An impulse which led them vaguely to foresee, though not to explain, the electric principle of spiritual life. End of footnote. The astronomers who, after years of profound study, have been enabled to measure the flames of the burning sun, and to find out that these are from 2,000 to 4,000 miles high, are nearly arrived at the conclusion that it is a world in a state of conflagration, in which they will be perfectly right. Those who hold that this earth of ours was once self-luminous are also right, for it was indeed so when first projected from the electric ring. The compilers or inventors of the Arabian Nights also hit upon a truth when they described human beings as forced through evil influences to take the forms of lower animals, a truth just explained in the law of retrogression. All art, all prophecy, all poesy should therefore be accepted eagerly and studied earnestly, for in them we find electric inspiration, out of which we are able to draw lessons for our guidance hereafter. The great point that scientists and artists have hitherto failed to discover is the existence of the central sphere and its surrounding electric circle. Once realize these two great facts, and all the wonders and mysteries of the universe are perfectly easy of comprehension. In conclusion, I offer no opinion as to which is Christ's Church, or the fountainhead of spirituality in the world. In all churches errors have intruded through unworthy and hypocritical members. In a crowded congregation of worshippers there may perhaps be only one or two who are free from self-interest and personal vanity. In sectarianism, for instance, there is no shred of Christianity. Lovers of God and followers of Christ must, in the first place, have perfect unity, and the bond uniting them must be an electric one of love and faith. No true Christian should be able to hate, despise, or envy the other. Were I called upon to select among the churches, I should choose that which has the most electricity working within it, and which is able to believe in a positive electrical communication between Christ and herself taking place daily on her altars. A church which holds, as it were, the other end of the telegraphic ray between Earth and the central sphere, and which is, therefore, able to exist among the storms of modern opinions, affording refuge and consolation to the few determined travellers who are bound onward and upward. I shall not name the church I mean, because it is the duty of everyone to examine and find it out for himself or herself. And even though this church instinctively works in the right direction, it is full of errors introduced by ignorant and unworthy members, errors which must be carefully examined and cast aside by degrees. But, as I said before, it is the only church which has principles of electricity within it, and is therefore destined to live, because electricity is life. Now I beseech the reader of this manuscript, to which I, Heliobas, append my hand and seal, to remember and realize earnestly the following invisible facts. First, that God and His Christ exist. Secondly, that while the little paltry affairs of our temporal state are being built up as crazily as a child's house of cards, the huge central sphere revolves, and the electric ring, strong and indestructible, is ever at its work of production and reabsorption. Thirdly, that every thought and word of every habitant on every planet is reflected in lightning language before the Creator's eyes as easily as we receive telegrams. Fourthly, that this world is the only spot in the universe where His existence is actually questioned and doubted, and the general spread of modern positivism, materialism, and atheism is one of the most terrific and meaning signs of the times. The work of separating the wheat from the chaff is beginning. Those who love and believe in God and spiritual beauty are about to be placed on one side. The millions who worship self are drawing together in vast opposing ranks on the other, and the moment approaches which is prophesied to be as the lightning that lighteneth out of the one part under heaven, and shineth even to the other part. In other words, the fiery whirlpool of the ring is nearly ready to absorb our planet in its vortex, and out of all who dwell upon its surface, how many shall reach the glorious central word of God? Of two men working in the same field, shall it not be as Christ foretold, the one shall be taken and the other left? Friend or pupil, reader, whoever thou art, take heed and foster thine own soul, for know that nothing can hinder the immortal germ within us from taking the form imposed upon it by our wills. Through love and faith it can become an angel, and perform wonders even while in its habitation of clay. Through indifference and apathy it can desert us altogether and forever. Through mockery and blasphemous disbelief it can sink into even a lower form than that of snake or toad. In our own unfettered hand lies our eternal destiny. Wonderful and terrible responsibility! Who shall dare to say we have no need of prayer? This document was signed Casimir Heliobas, and bore a seal on which the impression seemed to consist of two Arabic or Sanskrit words, which I could not understand. I put it carefully away with its companion manuscript under lock and key, and while I was yet pausing earnestly on its contents, Zara came into my room. She had finished her task in the studio, she said, and she now proposed a drive in the Bois as an agreeable way of passing the rest of the afternoon. "I want to be as long as possible in your company," she added, with a caressing sweetness in her manner, For now your friends have come to Paris, I expect you will soon be leaving us, so I must have as much of you as I can." My heart sank at the thought of parting from her, and I looked wistfully at her lovely face. Leo had followed her in from the studio, and seemed still very melancholy. "We shall always be good friends, Zara dearest," I said, "shall we not? Close, fond friends, like sisters?" "Sisters are not always fond of each other," remarked Zara, half gaily; "and you know there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother." "And what friend is that in your case?" I asked, half jestingly, half curiously. "Death," she replied, with a strange smile, in which there was both pathos and triumph. I started at her unexpected reply, and a kind of foreboding chilled my blood. I endeavoured, however, to speak cheerfully, as I said: "Why, of course, death sticks more closely to us than any friend or relative. But you look fitter to receive the embraces of life than of death, Zara." "They are both one and the same thing," she answered, "or rather, the one leads to the other. But do not let us begin to philosophize. Put on your things and come. The carriage is waiting." I readily obeyed her, and we enjoyed an exhilarating drive together. The rest of the day passed with us, all very pleasantly, and our conversation had principally to do with the progress of art and literature in many lands, and maintained itself equably on the level of mundane affairs. Among other things, we spoke of the Spanish violinist Sarasate, and I amused Heliobas by quoting to him some of the criticisms of the London daily papers on this great artist, such as: "He plays pieces which, though adapted to show his wonderful skill, are the veriest claptrap." "He lacks breadth and colour, a true type of the artist virtuoso," etc., etc. "Half these people do not know in the least what they mean by breadth and colour, or virtuosity," said Heliobas with a smile. "They think emotion, passion, all true sentiment combined with extraordinary technique, must be claptrap. Now the continent of Europe acknowledges Pablo de Sarasate as the first violinist living, and London would not be London unless it could thrust an obtruse opposing opinion in the face of the continent. England is the last country in the world to accept anything new. Its people are tired and blasé. Like highly trained circus horses, they want to trot or gallop always in the old grooves. It will always be so. Sarasate is like a brilliant meteor streaming across their narrow bit of the heaven of music. They stare, gape, and think it is an unnatural phenomenon, a virtuosity in the way of meteors, which they are afraid to accept, lest it set them on fire. What would you? The meteor shines and burns. It is always a meteor." So, talking lightly and gliding from subject to subject, the hours wore away, and we at last separated for the night. I shall always be glad to remember how tenderly Zara kissed me and wished me good repose, and I recall now, with mingled pain, wonder, and gratitude, how perfectly calm and contented I felt, as after my prayers I sank to sleep, unwarned, and therefore happily unconscious of what awaited me on the morrow. End of Section 25. Section 26 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Part 1. Death by Lightning. The morning of the next day dawned rather gloomily. A yellowish fog obscured the air, and there was a closeness and sultriness in the atmosphere that was strange for that wintry season. I had slept well, and rose with the general sense of ease and refreshment that I always experienced since I had been under the treatment of Heliobas. Those whose unhappy physical condition causes them to awake from uneasy slumber feeling almost more fatigued than when they retired to rest, can scarcely have any idea of the happiness it engenders to open untired, glad eyes with the morning light, to feel the very air a nourishment, to stand with lithe rested limbs in the bath of cool pure water, finding that limpid element obediently adding its quota to the vigour of perfect health, to tingle from head to foot with the warm current of life running briskly through the veins, making the heart merry, the brain clear, and all the powers of body and mind in active working condition. This is indeed most absolute enjoyment. Add to it the knowledge of the existence of one's own inner immortal spirit, the beautiful germ of light, in the fostering of which no labour is ever taken in vain, the living, wondrous thing that is destined to watch an eternity of worlds bloom and fade to bloom again like flowers, while itself, superior to them all, shall become ever more strong and radiant. With these surroundings and prospects, who shall say life is not worth living? Dear life, sweet moment, gracious opportunity, brief journey so well worth the taking, gentle exile so well worth enduring, thy bitterest sorrows are but blessings in disguise. Thy sharpest pains are brought upon us by ourselves, and even then are turned to warnings for our guidance, while above us, through us, and around us radiates the supreme love, unalterably tender. These thoughts and others like them, all more or less conducive to cheerfulness, occupied me till I had finished dressing. Melancholy was now no part of my nature, otherwise I might have been depressed by the appearance of the weather and the murkiness of the air. But since I learned the simple secrets of physical electricity, atmospheric influences have had no effect upon the equable poise of my temperament, a fact for which I cannot be too grateful, seeing how many of my fellow creatures permit themselves to be affected by changes in the wind, intense heat, intense cold, or other things of the like character. I went down to breakfast, singing softly on my way, and I found Zara already seated at the head of her table, while Heliobas was occupied in reading and sorting a pile of letters that lay beside his plate. Both greeted me with their usual warmth and heartiness. During the repast, however, the brother and sister were strangely silent, and once or twice I fancied that Zara's eyes filled with tears, though she smiled again so quickly and radiantly that I felt I was mistaken. A piece of behaviour on the part of Leo, too, filled me with dismay. He had been lying quietly at his master's feet for some time, when he suddenly arose, sat upright, and lifting his nose in air, uttered a most prolonged and desolate howl. Anything more thoroughly heartbroken and despairing than that cry I have never heard. After he had concluded it, the poor animal seemed ashamed of what he had done, and creeping meekly along, with drooping head and tail, he kissed his master's hand, then mine, and lastly Zara's. Finally he went into a distant corner and lay down again, as if his feelings were altogether too much for him. "Is he ill?" I asked pityingly. "I think not," replied Heliobas. "The weather is peculiar to day, close and almost thunderous. Dogs are very susceptible to such changes." At that moment the page entered bearing a silver salver, on which lay a letter, which he handed to his master and immediately retired. Heliobas opened and read it. "Ivan regrets he cannot dine with us today," he said, glancing at his sister. "He is otherwise engaged. He says, however, that he hopes to have the pleasure of looking in during the latter part of the evening." Zara inclined her head gently and made no other reply. A few seconds afterwards we rose from the table, and Zara, linking her arm through mine, said: "I want to have a talk with you while we can be alone. Come to my room." We went upstairs together, followed by the wise yet doleful Leo, who seemed determined not to let his mistress out of his sight. When we arrived at our destination, Zara pushed me gently into an easy chair, and seated herself in another one opposite. "I am going to ask a favour of you," she began, "because I know you will do anything to please me or Casimir. Is it not so?" I assured her she might rely upon my observing, with the truest fidelity, any request of hers, small or great. She thanked me, and resumed: "You know I have been working secretly in my studio for some time past. I have been occupied in the execution of two designs. One is finished, and is intended as a gift to Casimir. The other," she hesitated, "is incomplete. It is the colossal figure which was veiled when you first came in to see my little statue of evening. I made an attempt beyond my powers. In short, I cannot carry out the idea to my satisfaction. Now, dear, pay great attention to what I say. I have reason to believe that I shall be compelled to take a sudden journey. Promise me that when I am gone you will see that unfinished statue completely destroyed, utterly demolished." I could not answer her for a minute or two, I was so surprised by her words. "Going on a journey, Zara?" I said. "Well, if you are, I suppose you will soon return home again, and why should your statue be destroyed in the meantime? You may yet be able to bring it to final perfection." Zara shook her head and smiled half sadly. "I told you it was a favour I had to ask of you," she said, "and now you are unwilling to grant it." "I am not unwilling. Believe me, dearest, I would do anything to please you," I assured her. "But it seems so strange to me that you should wish the result of your labour destroyed, simply because you are going on a journey." "Strange as it seems, I desire it most earnestly," said Zara. "Otherwise But if you will not see it done for me, I must preside at the work of demolition myself, though I frankly confess it would be most painful to me." I interrupted her. "Say no more, Zara!" I exclaimed. "I will do as you wish when you are gone, you say?" "When I am gone," repeated Zara firmly, "and before you yourself leave this house, you will see that particular statue destroyed. You will thus do me a very great service." "Well," I said, "and when are you coming back again? Before I leave Paris?" "I hope so, I think so," she replied evasively. "At any rate, we shall meet again soon." "Where are you going?" I asked. She smiled, such a lovely, glad, and triumphant smile. "You will know my destination before to night has passed away," she answered. "In the meanwhile, I have your promise?" "Most certainly." She kissed me, and as she did so, a lurid flash caught my eyes and almost dazzled them. It was a gleam of fiery lustre from the electric jewel she wore. The day went on its usual course, and the weather seemed to grow murkier every hour. The air was almost sultry, and when during the afternoon I went into the conservatory to gather some of the glorious Marechal Niel roses that grew there in such perfection, the intense heat of the place was nearly insupportable. I saw nothing of Heliobas all day, and after the morning very little of Zara. She disappeared soon after luncheon, and I could not find her in her rooms nor in her studio, though I knocked at the door several times. Leo too was missing. After being alone for an hour or more, I thought I would pay a visit to the chapel, but on attempting to carry out this intention, I found its doors locked, an unusual circumstance which rather surprised me. Fancying that I heard the sound of voices within, I paused to listen, but all was profoundly silent. Strolling into the hall, I took up at random from a side table a little volume of poems unknown to me, called "Pygmalion in Cyprus," and seating myself in one of the luxurious Oriental easy chairs near the silvery sparkling fountain, I began to read. I opened the book I held at a ballad of kisses, which ran as follows: "There are 3 kisses that I call to mind, and I will sing their secrets as I go. The first, a kiss too courteous to be kind, was such a kiss as monks and maidens know, as sharp as frost, as blameless as the snow. The second kiss, ah God, I feel it yet, and evermore my soul will loathe the same. The toys and joys of fate I may forget, but not the touch of that divided shame. It clove my lips, it burnt me like a flame. The third, the final kiss, is one I use Morning and noon and night, and not amiss. Sorrow be mine if such I do refuse, and when I die, be love enwrapped in bliss, re-sanctified in heaven by such a kiss." This little gem, which I read and reread with pleasure, was only one of many in the same collection. The author was assuredly a man of genius. I studied his word melodies with intense interest, and noted with some surprise how original and beautiful were many of his fancies and similes. I say I noted them with surprise, because he was evidently a modern Englishman, and yet unlike any other of his writing species. His name was not Alfred Tennyson, nor Edwin Arnold, nor Matthew Arnold, nor Austin Dobson, nor Martin Tupper. He was neither plagiarist nor translator. He was actually an original man. I do not give his name here, as I consider it the duty of his own country to find him out and acknowledge him, which, as it is so proud of its literary standing, of course it will do in due season. On this, my first introduction to his poems, I became speedily absorbed in them, and was repeating to myself softly a verse which I remember now: "Hers was sweetest of sweet faces, hers the tenderest eyes of all; in her hair she had traces of a heavenly coronal, bringing sunshine to sad places where the sunlight could not fall." Then I was startled by the sound of a clock striking 6. I bethought myself of the people who were coming to dinner, and decided to go to my room and dress. Replacing the Pygmalion book on the table whence I had taken it, I made my way upstairs, thinking as I went of Zara and her strange request, and wondering what journey she was going on. I could not come to any satisfactory conclusion on this point. Besides, I had a curious disinclination to think about it very earnestly, though the subject kept recurring to my mind. Yet always some inward monitor seemed to assure me, as plainly as though the words were spoken in my ear: "It is useless for you to consider the reason of this or the meaning of that. Take things as they come in due order. One circumstance explains the other, and everything is always for the best." I prepared my Indian crepe dress for the evening, the same I had worn for Madame Didier's party at Cannes, only instead of having lilies of the valley to ornament it with, I arranged some clusters of the Marechal Niel roses I had gathered from the conservatory, lovely blossoms with their dewy pale gold centres forming perfect cups of delicious fragrance. These, received by a few delicate sprays of the maidenhair fern, formed a becoming finish to my simple costume. As I arrayed myself and looked at my own reflection in the long mirror, I smiled out of sheer gratitude. For health, joyous and vigorous, sparkled in my eyes, glowed on my cheeks, tinted my lips, and rounded my figure. The face that looked back at me from the glass was a perfectly happy one, ready to dimple into glad mirth or bright laughter. No shadow of pain or care remained upon it to remind me of past suffering, and I murmured half aloud, "Thank God!" "Amen!" said a soft voice, and turning round I saw Zara. But how shall I describe her? No words can adequately paint the glorious picture in which that night she seemed to move as in an atmosphere of her own creating. She wore a clinging robe of the richest, softest white satin, caught in at the waist by a zone of pearls which, from this size and purity, must have been priceless. Her beautiful neck and arms were bare, and 12 rows of pearls were clasped round her slender throat, supporting in their centre the electric stone, which shone with a soft, subdued radiance like the light of the young moon. Her rich dark hair was arranged in its usual fashion, that is, hanging down in one thick plait, which on this occasion was braided in and out with small pearls. On her bosom she wore a magnificent cluster of natural orange blossoms, and of these, while I gazed admiringly at her, I first spoke. "You look like a bride, Zara! You have all the outward signs of one: white satin, pearls, and orange blossoms!" She smiled. "They are the first cluster that has come out in our conservatory," she said, "and I could not resist them. As to the pearls, they belong to my mother, and are my favourite ornaments, and white satin is now no longer exclusively for brides. How soft and pretty that Indian crepe is! Your toilette is charming, and suits you to perfection. Are you quite ready?" "Quite," I answered. She hesitated and sighed. Then she raised her lovely eyes with a sort of wistful tenderness. "Before we go down, I should like you to kiss me once," she said. I embraced her fondly, and our lips met with a lingering sisterly caress. "You will never forget me, will you?" she asked, almost anxiously. "Never cease to think of me kindly?" "How fanciful you are to night, Zara dear!" I said. "As if I could forget you! I shall always think of you as the loveliest and sweetest woman in the world." "And when I am out of the world, what then?" she pursued. Remembering her spiritual sympathies, I answered at once: "Even then I shall know you to be one of the fairest of the angels. So you see, Zara darling, I shall always love you." "I think you will," she said meditatively. "You are one of us. But come, I hear voices downstairs. I think our expected guests have arrived, and we must be in the drawing room to receive them. Good bye, little friend." And she again kissed me. "Good bye?" I repeated in astonishment. "Why good bye?" "Because it is my fancy to say the word," she replied with quiet firmness. "Again, dear little friend, good bye." I felt bewildered, but she would not give me time to utter another syllable. She took my hand and hurried me with her downstairs, and in another moment we were both in the drawing room, receiving and saying polite nothings to the Everards and Challoners, who had all arrived together, resplendent in evening costume. Amy Everard, I thought, looked a little tired and fagged, though she rejoiced in a superb arrangement by Worth of ruby velvet and salmon pink. But though a perfect dress is consoling to most women, there are times when even that fails of its effect, and then Worth ceases to loom before the feminine eye as a sort of demigod, but dwindles insignificantly to the level of a mere tailor whose prices are ruinous. And this, I think, was the state of mind in which Mrs. Everard found herself that evening, or else she was a trifle jealous of Zara's harmonious grace and loveliness. Be this as it may, she was irritable, and whisperingly found fault with me for being in such good health. "You will have too much colour if you don't take care," she said almost pettishly, "and nothing is so unfashionable." "I know," I replied with due meekness. "It is a very bad style to be quite well. It's almost improper." She looked at me, and a glimmering smile lighted her features, but she would not permit herself to become good humoured, and she furled and unfurled her fan of pink ostrich feathers with some impatience. "Where did that child get all those pearls from?" she next inquired, with a gesture of her head towards Zara. "They belong to her mother," I answered, smiling as I heard Zara called a child, knowing as I did her real age. "She is actually wearing a small fortune on her person," went on Amy. "I wonder her brother allows her. Girls never understand the value of things of that sort. They should be kept for her till she's old enough to appreciate them." I made no reply. I was absorbed in watching Heliobas, who at that moment entered the room accompanied by Father Paul. He greeted his guests with warmth and unaffected heartiness, and all present were, I could see, at once fascinated by the dignity of his presence and the charm of his manner. To an uninstructed eye there was nothing unusual about him, but to me there was a change in his expression which, as it were, warned and startled me. A deep shadow of anxiety in his eyes made them look more sombre and less keen. His smile was not so sweet as it was stern, and there was an undefinable something in his very bearing that suggested what? Defiance? Yes, defiance. And it was this which, when I had realized it, curiously alarmed me. For what had he, Heliobas, to do with even the thought of defiance? Did not all his power come from the knowledge of the necessity of obedience to the spiritual powers within and without? Quick as light the words spoken to me at Atzel regarding him came back to my remembrance. "Even as he is my beloved, so let him not fail to hear my voice." What if he should fail? A kind of instinct came upon me that some immediate danger of this threatened him, and I braced myself up to a firm determination that, if this was so, I, out of my deep gratitude to him, would do my utmost best to warn him in time. While these thoughts possessed me, the hum of gay conversation went on, and Zara's bright laughter ever and again broke like music on the air. Father Paul, too, proved himself to be of quite a festive and jovial disposition, for he made himself agreeable to Mrs. Challoner and her daughters, and entertained them with the ease and bonhomie of an accomplished courtier and man of the world. End of Section 26. Section 27 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Part 2. Death by Lightning. Dinner was announced in the usual way, that is, with the sound of music played by the electric instrument devoted to that purpose, a performance which elicited much admiration from all the guests. Heliobas led the way into the dining room with Mrs. Everard. Colonel Everard followed, with Zara on one arm and the eldest Miss Challoner on the other. Mr. Challoner and myself came next, and Father Paul, with Mrs. Challoner and her other daughter Effie, brought up the rear. There was a universal murmur of surprise and delight as the dinner table came in view, and its arrangement was indeed a triumph of art. In the centre was placed a large round of crystal in imitation of a lake, and on this apparently floated a beautiful gondola steered by the figure of a gondolier, both exquisitely wrought in fine Venetian glass. The gondolier was piled high with a cargo of roses, but the wonder of it all was that the whole design was lit up by electricity. Electric sparkles like drops of dew shone on the leaves of the flowers. The gondola was lit from end to end with electric stars, which were reflected with prismatic brilliancy in the crystal below. The gondolier's long pole glittered with what appeared to be drops of water tinged by the moonlight, but which were really an electric wire, and in his cap flashed an electric diamond. The whole ornament scintillated and glowed like a marvellous piece of curiously contrived jewel work. And this was not all. Beside every guest at table a slender vase, shaped like a long stemmed Nile lily, held roses and ferns, in which were hidden tiny electric stars, causing the blossoms to shine with a transparent and almost fairy like lustre. 4 graceful youths, clad in the Armenian costume, stood waiting silently round the table till all present were seated, and then they commenced the business of serving the viands with swift and noiseless dexterity. As soon as the soup was handed round, tongues were loosened, and the Challoners, who had been gazing at everything in almost open-mouthed astonishment, began to reveal their feelings by warm expressions of unqualified admiration, in which Colonel and Mrs. Everard were not slow to join. "I do say, and I will say, this beats all I've ever seen," said good Mrs. Challoner, as she bent to examine the glittering vase of flowers near her plate. "And this is real electric light? And is it perfectly harmless?" Heliobas, smiling, assured her of the safety of his table decorations. "Electricity," he said, "though the most powerful of masters, is the most docile of slaves. It is capable of the smallest as well as of the greatest uses. It can give with equal certainty life or death. In fact, it is the keynote of creation." "Is that your theory, sir?" asked Colonel Everard. "It is not only my theory," answered Heliobas. "It is a truth indisputable and unalterable to those who have studied the mysteries of electric science." "And you base all your medical treatment on this principle?" pursued the Colonel. "Certainly. Your young friend here, who came to me from Cannes, looking as if she had but a few months to live, can bear witness to the efficacy of my method." Every eye was now turned upon me, and I looked up and laughed. "Do you remember, Amy," I said, addressing Mrs. Everard, "how you told me I looked like a sick nun at Cannes? What do I look like now?" "You look as if you had never been ill in your life," she replied. "I was going to say," remarked Mr. Challoner in his deliberate manner, "that you remind me very much of a small painting of Diana that I saw in the Louvre the other day. You have the same sort of elasticity in your movements, and the same bright, healthy eyes." I bowed, still smiling. "I did not know you were such a flatterer, Mr. Challoner. Diana thanks you." The conversation now became general, and turned, among other subjects, upon the growing reputation of Raffaello Cellini. "What surprises me in that young man," said Colonel Everard, "is his colouring. It is simply marvellous. He was amiable enough to present me with a little landscape scene, and the effect of light upon it is so powerfully done that you would swear the sun was actually shining through it." The fine sensitive mouth of Heliobas curved in a somewhat sarcastic smile. "Mere trickery, my dear sir, a piece of claptrap," he said lightly. "This is what would be said of such a picture in England at least, and it will be said by many oracular, long established newspapers, while Cellini lives. As soon as he is dead, c'est autre chose. He will then most probably be acknowledged the greatest master of the age.
There will even be a Cellini school of colouring, where a select company of daubers will profess to know the secret that has died with him. It is the way of the world."
Mr. Challoner's rugged face showed signs of satisfaction, and his shrewd eyes twinkled.
"Right you are, sir," he said, holding up his glass of wine. "I drink to you, sir. I agree with you. I calculate there's a good many worlds flying round in space, but a more ridiculous, feeble minded, contrary sort of world than this one I defy any archangel to find."
Heliobas laughed, nodded, and after a slight pause resumed.
"It is astonishing to me that people do not see to what an infinite number of uses they could put the little rediscovery they have made of luminous paint. In that simple thing there is a secret which as yet they do not guess, a wonderful, beautiful, scientific secret which may perhaps take them a few hundred years to find out. In the meantime they have got hold of one end of the thread. They can make luminous paint, and with it they can paint lighthouses, and what is far more important, ships. Vessels in mid ocean will have no need of fog signals and different coloured lamps. Their own coat of paint will be sufficient to light them safely on their way. Even rooms can be so painted as to be perfectly luminous at night. A friend of mine residing in Italy has a luminous ballroom, where the ceiling is decorated with a moon and stars and electric light. The effect is exceedingly lovely, and though people think a great deal of money must have been laid out upon it, it is perhaps the only great ballroom in Italy that has been really cheaply fitted up. But as I said before, there is another secret behind the invention or discovery of luminous paint, a secret which, when once revealed, will revolutionize all the schools of art in the world."
"Do you know this secret?" asked Mrs. Challoner.
"Yes, madam, perfectly."
"Then why don't you disclose it for the benefit of everybody?" demanded Erne Challoner.
"Because, my dear lady, no one would believe me if I did. The time is not yet ripe for it. The world must wait till its people are better educated."
"Better educated!" exclaimed Mrs. Everard. "Why, there is nothing talked of nowadays but education and progress. The very children are wiser than their parents."
"The children!" returned Heliobas, half inquiringly, half indignantly. "At the rate things are going, there will be no children left. They will all be tired little old men and women before they are in their teens. The very babes will be born old. Many of them are being brought up without any faith in God or religion. The result will be an increase of vice and crime. The purblind philosophers, miscalled wise men, who teach the children by the light of poor human reason only, and do away with faith in spiritual things, are bringing down upon the generations to come an unlooked for and most terrific curse. Childhood, the happy, innocent, sweet, unthinking, almost angelic age at which nature would have us believe in fairies and all the delicate aerial fancies of poets, who are after all the only true sages. Childhood, I say, is being gradually stamped out under the cruel iron heel of the period. A period not of wisdom, health, or beauty, but one of drunken delirium, in which the world rushes feverishly along, its eyes fixed on one hard, glittering, stony featured idol, gold. Education! Is it education to teach the young that their chances of happiness depend on being richer than their neighbours? Yet that is what it all tends to. Get on, be successful, trample on others, but push forward yourself. Money! Let its chink be your music, let its yellow shine be fairer than the eyes of love or friendship. Let its piles accumulate and ever accumulate. There are beggars in the streets, but they are impostors. There is poverty in many places, but why seek to relieve it? Why lessen the sparkling heaps of gold by so much as a coin? Accumulate and ever accumulate. Live so, and then die. And then, who knows what then?"
His voice had been full of ringing eloquence as he spoke, but at these last words it sank into a low, shrilling tone of solemnity and earnestness. We all looked at him, fascinated by his manner, and were silent. Mr. Challoner was the first to break the impressive pause.
"I'm not a speaker, sir," he observed slowly, "but I've got a good deal of feeling somewheres, And you'll allow me to say that I feel your words. I think they're right true. I've often wanted to say what you've said, but haven't seen my way clear to. Anyhow, I've had a very general impression about me that what we call society has of late years been going, per express service, direct to the devil, if the ladies will excuse me for plain speaking. And as the journey is being taken by choice and free will, I suppose there's no hindrance or stoppage possible. Besides, it's a downward line, and curiously free from obstructions." "Bravo, John!" exclaimed Mrs. Challoner. "You are actually corning out. I never heard you indulge in similes before." "Well, my dear," returned her husband, somewhat gratified, "better late than never. A simile is a good thing if it isn't overcrowded. For instance, Mr. Swinburne's similes are laid on too thick sometimes. There is a verse of his which, with all my admiration for him, I never could quite fathom. It is where he earnestly desires to be as 'any leaf of any tree,' or failing that, he wouldn't mind becoming as bones under the deep sharp sea. I tried hard to see the point of that, but couldn't fix it." We all laughed. Zara, I thought, was especially merry and looked her loveliest. She made an excellent hostess, and exerted herself to the utmost to charm, an effort in which she easily succeeded. The shadow on the face of her brother had not disappeared, and once or twice I noticed that Father Paul looked at him with a certain kindly anxiety. The dinner approached its end. The dessert, with its luxurious dishes of rare fruit, such as peaches, plantains, hothouse grapes, and even strawberries, was served, and with it a delicious sparkling topaz tinted wine of Eastern origin, called Crulla, which was poured out to us in Venetian glass goblets, wherein lay diamond like lumps of ice. The air was so exceedingly oppressive that evening that we found this beverage most refreshing. When Zara's goblet was filled, she held it up smiling, and said, "I have a toast to propose." "Hear, hear!" murmured the gentlemen, Heliobas excepted.
"To our next merry meeting." And as she said this, she kissed the rim of the cup, and made a sign as though wafting it towards her brother. He started as if from a reverie, seized his glass, and drained off its contents to the last drop. Everyone responded with heartiness to Zara's toast, and then Colonel Everard proposed the health of the fair hostess, which was drunk with enthusiasm. After this Zara gave the signal, and all the ladies rose to adjourn to the drawing room. As I passed Heliobas on my way out, he looked so sombre and almost threatening of aspect that I ventured to whisper, "Remember Azul!"
"She has forgotten me," he muttered.
"Never, never!" I said earnestly. "Oh, Heliobas, what is wrong with you?" He made no answer, and there was no opportunity to say more, as I had to follow Zara. But I felt very anxious, though I scarcely knew why, and I lingered at the door and glanced back at him. As I did so, a low rumbling sound, like chariot wheels rolling afar off, broke suddenly on our ears.
"Thunder," remarked Mr. Challoner quietly. "I thought we should have it. It has been unnaturally warm all day. A good storm will clear the air."
In my brief backward look at Heliobas, I noted that when that far distant thunder sounded, he grew very pale. Why? He was certainly not one to have any dread of a storm. He was absolutely destitute of fear. I went into the drawing room with a hesitating step. My instincts were all awake and beginning to warn me, and I murmured softly a prayer to that strong, invisible, majestic spirit which I knew must be near me, my guardian angel. And I was answered instantly. My foreboding grew into a positive certainty that some danger menaced Heliobas, and that if I desired to be his friend, I must be prepared for an emergency. Receiving this, as all such impressions should be received, as a direct message sent me for my guidance, I grew calmer, and braced up my energies to oppose something, though I knew not what. Zara was showing her lady visitors a large album of Italian photographs, and explaining them as she turned the leaves. As I entered the room, she said eagerly to me, "Play to us, dear, something soft and plaintive. We all delight in your music, you know."
"Did you hear the thunder just now?" I asked irreverently. "It was thunder! I thought so!" said Mrs. Everard. "Oh, I do hope there's not going to be a storm. I am so afraid of a storm!"
"You are nervous?" questioned Zara kindly, as she engaged her attention with some very fine specimens among the photographs, consisting of views from Venice.
"Well, I suppose I am," returned Amy, half laughing. "Yet I am plucky about most things too. Still, I don't like to hear the elements quarrelling together. They are too much in earnest about it, and no person can pacify them."
Zara smiled and gently repeated her request to me for some music, a request in which Mrs. Challoner and her daughters eagerly joined. As I went to the piano I thought of Edgar Allan Poe's exquisite poem: "In heaven a spirit doth dwell, Whose heartstrings are a lute; None sing so wildly well As the angel Israfel; And the giddy stars, so legends tell, Ceasing their hymns, attend the spell Of his voice all mute." As I poised my fingers above the keys of the instrument, another long, low, ominous roll of thunder swept up from the distance and made the room tremble.
"Play, play, for goodness' sake!" exclaimed Mrs. Everard, "and then we shall not be obliged to fix our attention on the approaching storm."
I played a few soft opening arpeggio passes, while Zara seated herself in an easy chair near the window, and the other ladies arranged themselves on sofas and ottomans to their satisfaction. The room was exceedingly close, and the scent of the flowers that were placed about in profusion was almost too sweet and overpowering. "And they say, the starry choir, And the other listening things, That Israfeli's fire Is owing to that lyre By which Lie sits and sings The trembling living wire Of those unusual strings." How these verses haunted me! With them floating in my mind I played, losing myself in mazes of melody, and travelling harmoniously in and out of the different keys with that sense of perfect joy known only to those who can improvise with ease, and catch the unwritten music of nature, which always appeals most strongly to emotions that are unspoilt by contact with the world, and which are quick to respond to what is purely instinctive art. I soon became thoroughly absorbed and forgot that there were any persons present. In fancy I imagined myself again in view of the glory of the electric ring. Again I seemed to behold the opaline radiance of the central sphere, where love's a grown up God, where the houri glances are imbued with all the beauty which we worship in a star. By and by I found my fingers at the work of tenderly unravelling a little skein of major melody, as soft and childlike as the innocent babble of a small brooklet flowing under ferns. I followed this airy suggestion obediently, till it led me of itself to its fitting end. When I ceased playing, I was greeted by a little burst of applause, and looking up, saw that all the gentlemen had come in from the dining room and were standing near me. The stately figure of Heliobas was the most prominent in the group. He stood erect, one hand resting lightly on the framework of the piano, and his eyes met mine fixedly. "You were inspired," he said with a grave smile, addressing me. "You did not observe our entrance." I was about to reply when a loud appalling crash of thunder rattled above us, as if some huge building had suddenly fallen into ruins. It startled us all into silence for a moment, and we looked into each other's face with a certain degree of awe. "That was a good one," remarked Mr. Challoner. "There was nothing undecided about that clap. Its mind was made up." Zara suddenly rose from her seat and drew aside the window curtains. "I wonder if it is raining," she said. Amy Everard uttered a little shriek of dismay. "Oh, don't open the blinds!" she exclaimed. "It is really dangerous." Heliobas glanced at her with a little sarcastic smile. "Take a seat on the other side of the room if you are alarmed, madam," he said quietly, placing a chair in the position he suggested, which Amy accepted eagerly. She would, I believe, have gladly taken refuge in the coal cellar had he offered it. Zara, in the meantime, who had not heard Mrs. Everard's exclamation of fear, had drawn up one of the blinds, and stood silently looking out upon the night. Instinctively we all joined her, with the exception of Amy,
and looked out also. The skies were very dark. A faint moaning wind stirred the tops of the leafless trees, but there was no rain. A dry volcanic heat pervaded the atmosphere. In fact, we all felt the air so stifling that Heliobas threw open the window altogether, saying as he did so: "In a thunderstorm it is safer to have the windows open than shut. Besides, one cannot suffocate." A brilliant glare of light flashed suddenly upon our vision. The heavens seemed torn open from end to end, and a broad lake of pale blue fire lay quivering in the heart of the mountainous black clouds. For a second only, an onrushing, ever increasing, rattling roar of thunder ensued that seemed to shake the very earth, and all was again darkness. "This is magnificent!" cried Mrs. Challoner, who with her family had travelled a great deal, and was quite accustomed to hurricanes and other inconveniences caused by the unaccommodating behaviour of the elements. "I don't think I ever saw anything like it, John dear. Even that storm we saw at Chamounix was not any better than this." "Well," returned her husband meditatively, "you see we had the snow mountains there, and the effect was pretty lively. Then there were the echoes. Those cavernous echoes were grand. What was that passage in Job, Effie, that I used to say they reminded me of? 'The pillars of heaven tremble, and are astonished at his reproof. The thunder his power, who can understand?'" replied Effie Challoner reverently. "That's it," he replied. "I opine that Job was pretty correct in his ideas. Don't you, Reverend Sir?" turning to Father Paul. The priest nodded and held up his finger warningly. "That lady, Mrs. Everard, is going to sing or play, I think," he observed. "Shall we not keep silence?" I looked towards Amy in some surprise. I knew she sang very prettily, but I had thought she was rendered too nervous by the storm to do aught but sit quiet in her chair. However, there she was at the piano, and in another moment her fresh, sweet mezzo soprano rang softly through the room in Tostai's plaintive song, "Good bye." We listened, but none of us moved from the open window, where we still inhaled what air there was, and watched the lowering sky. "Hush, a voice from far away, listen and learn, it seems to say, all the tomorrows shall be as today," sang Amy with pathetic sweetness. Zara suddenly moved as if oppressed from her position among us as we stood clustered together, and stepped out through the French window into the outside balcony, her head uncovered to the night. "You will catch cold!" Mrs. Challoner and I both called to her simultaneously. She shook her head, smiling back at us, and folding her arms lightly on the stone balustrade, leaned there and looked up at the clouds. "The link must break and the lamp must die. Good bye to hope, good bye, good bye." Amy's voice was a peculiarly thrilling one, and on this occasion sounded with more than its usual tenderness. What with her singing and the invisible presence of the storm, an utter silence possessed us. Not one of us cared to move. End of Section 27. Section 28 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Part 3. Death by Lightning. Heliobas once stepped to his sister's side in the open balcony, and said something, as I thought, to warn her against taking cold, but it was a very brief whisper, and he almost immediately returned to his place amongst us. Zara looked very lovely out there. The light coming from the interior of the room glistened softly on the sheen of her satin dress and its ornaments of pearls, and the electric stone on her bosom shone faintly, like a star on a rainy evening. Her beautiful face, turned upwards to the angry sky, was half in light and half in shade. A smile parted her lips, and her eyes were bright with a look of interest and expectancy. Another sudden glare, and the clouds were again broken asunder, but this time in a jagged and hasty manner, as though a naked sword had been thrust through them and immediately withdrawn. "That was a nasty flash," said Colonel Everard, with an observant glance at the lovely Juliet-like figure on the balcony. "Mademoiselle, had you better not come in?" "When it begins to rain, I will come in,"
she said, without changing her posture. "I hear the singing so well out here. Besides, I love this storm." A tumultuous crash of thunder, tremendous for its uproar and the length of time it was prolonged, made us look at each other with anxious faces. "What are we waiting for, oh my heart? Kiss me straight on the brows and part Again, again, my heart, my heart. What are we waiting for, you and I? A pleading look, a stifled cry, goodbye forever." Horror! What was that? A lithe, swift serpent of fire, twisting venomously through the dark heavens! Zara raised her arms, looked up, smiled, and fell senseless, with such appalling suddenness that we had scarcely recovered from the blinding terror of that forked lightning flash, when we saw her lying prone before us on the balcony, where one instant before she had stood erect and smiling. With exclamations of alarm and distress we lifted and bore her within the room, and laid her tenderly down upon the nearest sofa. At that moment a deafening, terrific thunderclap, one only, as if a huge bombshell had burst in the air, shook the ground under our feet, and then with a swish and swirl of long pent up and suddenly released wrath, down came the rain. Amy's voice died away in a last "good bye," and she rushed from the piano with pale face and trembling lips, gasping out: "What has happened? What is the matter?" "She was stunned by a lightning flash," I said, trying to speak calmly, while I loosened Zara's dress and sprinkled her forehead with eau de cologne from a scent bottle Mrs. Challoner had handed to me. "She will recover in a few minutes." But my limbs trembled under me, and tears, in spite of myself, forced their way into my eyes. Heliobas, meanwhile, his countenance white and set as a marble mask, shut the window fiercely, pulled down the blind, and drew the heavy silken curtains close. He then approached his sister's senseless form, and taking her wrist tenderly, felt for her pulse. We looked on in the deepest anxiety. The Challoner girls shivered with terror, and began to cry. Mrs. Everard, with more self possession, dipped a handkerchief in cold water and laid it on Zara's temples, but no faint sigh parted the set yet smiling lips. No sign of life was visible. All this while the rain swept down in gusty torrents and rattled furiously against the window panes, while the wind, no longer a moan, had risen into a shriek, as of baffled yet vindictive anger. At last Heliobas spoke. "I should be glad of other medical skill than my own," he said in low and stifled accents. "This may be a long fainting fit." Mr. Challoner at once proffered his services. "I will go for you anywhere you like," he said cheerily, "and I think my wife and daughters had better come with me. Our carriage is sure to be in waiting. It'll be necessary for the lady to have perfect quiet when she recovers, and visitors are best away. You need not be alarmed, I am sure. By her colour it is evident she is only in a swoon. What doctor shall I send?" Heliobas named one Dr. Morini, 10 Avenue de l'Alma. "Right. He shall be here straight. Come, wife, come, girls. Mrs. Everard, we'll send back our carriage for you and Colonel. Good night. We'll call tomorrow and inquire after Mademoiselle." Heliobas gratefully pressed his hand as he withdrew, and his wife and daughters, with whispered farewells, followed him. We who were left behind all remained near Zara, doing everything we could think of to restore animation to that senseless form. Some of the servants, too, hearing what had happened, gathered in a little cluster at the drawing room door, looking with pale and alarmed faces at the deathlike figure of their beautiful mistress. Half an hour or more must have passed in this manner. Within the room there was a dreadful silence, but outside the rain poured down in torrents, and the savage wind howled and tore at the windows like a besieging army. Suddenly Amy Everard, who had been quietly and skilfully assisting me in rubbing Zara's hands and bathing her forehead, grew faint, staggered, and would have fallen had not her husband caught her on his arm. "I am frightened," she gasped. "I cannot bear it. She looks so still, and she is growing rigid like a corpse. Oh, if she should be dead!" And she hid her face on her husband's breast. At that moment we heard the grating of wheels on the gravel outside. It was the Challoners' carriage returned. The coachman, after depositing his master and family at the Grand Hotel, had driven rapidly back in the teeth of the stinging sleet and rain to bring the message that Dr. Morini would be with us as soon as possible.
"Then," whispered Colonel Everard gently to me, "I'll take Amy home. She is thoroughly upset, and it's no use having her going off into hysterics. I'll call with Challoner to morrow." And with a kindly parting nod of encouragement to us all, he slipped softly out of the room, half leading, half carrying his trembling wife, and in a couple of minutes we heard the carriage again drive away. Left alone at last with Heliobas and Father Paul, I, kneeling at the side of my darling Zara, looked into their faces for comfort, but found none. The dry eyed despair on the countenance of Heliobas pierced me to the heart. The pitying, solemn expression of the venerable priest touched me as with icy cold. The lovely marble like whiteness and stillness of the figure before me filled me with a vague terror. Making a strong effort to control my voice, I called in a low, clear tone, "Zara! Zara!" No sign, not the faintest flicker of an eyelash. Only the sound of the falling rain and the moaning wind. The thunder had long ago ceased. Suddenly a something attracted my gaze, which first surprised and then horrified me. The jewel, the electric stone on Zara's bosom, no longer shone. It was like a piece of dull, unpolished pebble. Grasping at the meaning of this with overwhelming instinctive rapidity, I sprang up and caught the arm of Heliobas. "You," I whispered hurriedly, "you can restore her. Do as you did with Prince Ivan. You can, you must! That stone she wears, the light has gone out of it. If that means, and I'm sure it does, that life has for a little while gone out of her, you can bring it back. Quick, quick! You have the power!" He looked at me with burning grief haunted eyes, and a sigh that was almost a groan escaped his lips. "I have no power," he said, "not over her. I told you she was dominated by a higher force than mine. What can I do? Nothing. Worse than nothing. I am utterly helpless." I stared at him in a kind of desperate horror. "Do you mean to tell me," I said slowly, "that she is dead? Really dead?" He was about to answer when one of the watching servants announced in a low tone, "Dr. Morini." The newcomer was a wiry, keen eyed little Italian. His movements were quick, decisive, and all to the point of action. The first thing he did was to scatter the little group of servants right and left, and send them about their business. The next to close the doors of the room against all intrusion. He then came straight up to Heliobas, and pressing his hand in a friendly manner, said briefly, "How and when did this happen?" Heliobas told him in as few words as possible. Dr. Morini then bent over Zara's lifeless form and examined her features attentively. He laid his ear against her heart and listened. Finally he caught sight of the round, lustreless pebble hanging at her neck, suspended by its string of pearls. Very gently he moved this aside, looked, and beckoned us to come and look also. Exactly on the spot where the electric stone had rested, a small circular mark, like a black bruise, tainted the fair soft skin, a mark no larger than a small finger ring. "Death by electricity," said Dr. Morini quietly. "Must have been instantaneous. The lightning flash or downward electric current lodged itself here where this mark is, and passed directly through the heart. Perfectly painless, but of course fatal. She has been dead some time." And replacing the stone ornament in its former position, he stepped back with a suggestive glance at Father Paul. I listened and saw, but I was in a state of stupefaction. Dead? My beautiful, gay, strong Zara dead? Impossible! I knelt beside her. I called her again and again by every endearing and tender name I could think of. I kissed her sweet lips. Oh, they were as cold as ice, and chilled my blood. As one in a dream, I saw Heliobas advance. He kissed her forehead and mouth. He reverently unclasped the pearls from about her throat, and with them took off the electric stone. Then Father Paul stepped slowly forward, and in place of that once brilliant gem, now so dim and destitute of fire, he laid a crucifix upon the fair and gentle breast, motionless forever. At the sight of this sacred symbol, some tense cord seemed to snap in my brain, and I cried out wildly: "Oh, no, no, not that! That is for the dead. Zara is not dead. It is all a mistake, a mistake! She will be quite well presently, and she will smile and tell you how foolish you were to think her dead. Dead! She cannot be dead. It is impossible, quite impossible!" And I broke into a passion of sobs and tears. Very gently and kindly Dr. Morini drew me away, and by dint of friendly persuasion, in which there was also a good deal of firm determination, led me into the hall, where he made me swallow a glass of wine. As I could not control my sobs, he spoke with some sternness: "Mademoiselle, you can do no good by giving way in this manner. Death is a very beautiful and solemn thing, and it is irreverent to show unseemly passion in such a great presence. You loved your friend. Let it be a comfort to you that she died painlessly. Control yourself in order to assist in rendering her the last few gentle services necessary, and try to console the desolate brother who looks in real need of encouragement." These last words roused me. I forced back my tears and dried my eyes. "I will, Dr. Morini," I said in a trembling voice. "I am ashamed to be so weak. I know what I ought to do, and I will do it. You may trust me." He looked at me approvingly. "That is well," he said briefly. "And now, as I am of no use here, I will say good night. Remember, excessive grief is mere selfishness. Resignation is heroism." He was gone. I nerved myself to the task I had before me, and within an hour the fair casket of what had been Zara lay on an open bier in the little chapel, lights burning round it, and flowers strewn above it in mournful profusion. We left her body arrayed in its white satin garb. The cluster of orange blossoms she had gathered still bloomed upon the cold breast where the crucifix lay, but in the tresses of the long dark hair I wove a wreath of lilies instead of the pearls we had undone. And now I knelt beside the bier absorbed in thought. Some of the weeping servants had assembled and knelt about in little groups. The tall candles on the altar were lit, and Father Paul, clad in mourning priestly vestments, prayed there in silence. The storm of rain and wind still raged without, and the windows of the chapel shook and rattled with the violence of the tempest. A distant clock struck one, with a deep clang that echoed throughout the house. I shuddered. So short a time had elapsed since Zara had been alive and well. Now I could not bear to think that she was gone from me for ever. For ever, did I say? No, not for ever. Not so long as love exists, love that shall bring us together again in that far off sphere where... Hush! What was that? The sound of the organ? I looked around me in startled wonderment. There was no one seated at the instrument. It was shut close. The lights on the altar and round the bier burnt steadily. The motionless figure of the priest before the tabernacle, the praying servants of the household, all was unchanged. But certainly a flood of music rolled grandly on the ear, music that drowned for a moment the howling noise of the battering wind. I rose softly and touched one of the kneeling domestics on the shoulder. "Did you hear the organ?" I said. The woman looked up at me with tearful, alarmed eyes. "No, mademoiselle." I paused, listening. The music grew louder and louder, and surged round me in waves of melody. Evidently no one in the chapel heard it but myself. I looked about for Heliobas, but he had not entered. He was most probably in his study, whither he had retired to grieve in secret when he had borne Zara's body to its present couch of dreamless sleep. These sounds were meant for me alone, then? I waited, and the music gradually died away, and as I resumed my kneeling position by the bier, all was again silent, save for the unabated raging of the storm. A strange calmness now fell on my spirits. Some invisible hand seemed to hold me still and tearless. Zara was dead. I realized it now. I began to consider that she must have known her fate beforehand. This was what she had meant when she said she was going on a journey. The more I thought of this, the quieter I became, and I hid my face in my hands and prayed earnestly. A touch roused me, an imperative burning touch. An airy brightness, like a cloud with sunshine falling through it, hovered above Zara's bier. I gazed breathlessly. I could not move my lips to utter a sound. A face looked at me, a face angelically beautiful. It smiled. I stretched out my hands. I struggled for speech, and managed to whisper: "Zara, you have come back?" Her voice, so sweetly familiar, answered me: "To life? Ah, never, never again! I am too happy to return. But save him, save my brother. Go to him. He is in danger. To you is given the rescue. Save him, and for me rejoice and grieve no more." The face vanished, the brightness faded, and I sprang up from my knees in haste. For one instant I looked at the beautiful dead body of the friend I loved, with its set mouth and placid features, and then I smiled. This was not Zara. She was alive and happy. This fair clay was but clay doomed to perish, but she was imperishable. "Save him, save my brother!" These words rang in my ears. I hesitated no longer. I determined to seek Heliobas at once. Swiftly and noiselessly I slipped out of the chapel. As the door swung behind me, I heard a sound that first made me stop in sudden alarm, and then hurry on with increased eagerness. There was no mistaking it. It was the clash of steel. End of section 28.
Section 29 of A Romance of Two Worlds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Part 1. A Struggle for the Mastery. I rushed to the study door, tore aside the velvet hangings, and faced Heliobas and Prince Ivan Petrovsky. They held drawn weapons, which they lowered at my sudden entrance, and paused irresolutely. "What are you doing?" I cried, addressing myself to Heliobas. "With the dead body of your sister in the house, you can fight? You two?" And I looked reproachfully at Prince Ivan. "You also can desecrate the sanctity of death, and yet you loved her?" The Prince spoke not, but clenched his sword hilt with a fiercer grasp, and glared wildly on his opponent. His eyes had a look of madness in them. His dress was much disordered, his hair wet with drops of rain, his face ghastly white, and his whole demeanour was that of a man distraught with grief and passion. But he uttered no word. Heliobas spoke. He was coldly calm, and balanced his sword lightly on his open hand as if it were a toy. "This gentleman," he said with deliberate emphasis, "happened on his way hither to meet Dr. Morini, who informed him of the fatal catastrophe which has caused my sister's death. Instead of respecting the sacredness of my solitude under the circumstances, he thrust himself rudely into my presence, and before I could address him, struck me violently in the face, and accused me of being my sister's murderer. Such conduct can only meet with one reply. I gave him his choice of weapons. He chose swords. Our combat has just begun. We are anxious to resume it. Therefore, if you, mademoiselle, will have the goodness to retire—" I interrupted him. "I shall certainly not retire," I said firmly. "This behavior on both your parts is positive madness. Prince Ivan, please listen to me. The circumstances of Zara's death were plainly witnessed by me and others. Her brother is as innocent of having caused it as I am." And I recounted to him quietly all that had happened during that fatal and eventful evening. He listened moodily, tracing out the pattern of the carpet with the point of his sword. When I had finished, he looked up, and a bitter smile crossed his features. "I wonder, mademoiselle," he said, "that your residence in this accursed house has not taught you better. I quite believe all you say, that Zara, unfortunate girl that she was, received her death by a lightning flash. But answer me this: who made her capable of attracting atmospheric electricity? Who charged her beautiful delicate body with a vile compound of electrical fluid, so that she was as a living magnet, bound to draw towards herself electricity in all its forms? Who tampered with her fine brain and made her imagine herself allied to a spirit of air? Who but he, yonder unscrupulous wretch? He who, in pursuit of his miserable science, practiced his most dangerous experiments on his sister, regardless of her health, her happiness, her life. I say he is her murderer, her remorseless murderer, and I thrice damned villain!" And he sprang forward to renew the combat. I stepped quietly, unflinchingly between him and Heliobas. "Stop!" I exclaimed. "This cannot go on. Zara herself forbids it." The Prince paused and looked at me in a sort of stupefaction. "Zara forbids it!" he muttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I went on, "that I have seen Zara since her death. I have spoken to her. She herself sent me here." Prince Ivan stared, and then burst into a fit of wild laughter. "Little fool!" he cried to me. "He has maddened you too, then! You are also a victim! Miserable girl, out of my path! Revenge! Revenge, while I am yet sane!" Then pushing me roughly aside, he cast away his sword and shouted to Heliobas: "Hand to hand, villain! No more of these toy weapons! Hand to hand!" Heliobas instantly threw down his sword also, and rushing forward simultaneously, they closed together in savage conflict. Heliobas was the taller and more powerful of the two, but Prince Ivan seemed imbued with the spirit of 100 devils, and sprang at his opponent's throat with the silent, breathless ferocity of a tiger. At first Heliobas appeared to be simply on the defensive, and his agile, skillful movements were all used to parry and ward off the other's grappling eagerness. But as I watched the struggle, myself speechless and powerless, I saw his face change. Instead of its calm and almost indifferent expression, there came a look which was completely foreign to it, a look of savage determination, bordering on positive cruelty. In a moment I saw what was taking place in his mind. The animal passions of the mere man were aroused. The spiritual force was utterly forgotten. The excitement of the contest was beginning to tell, and the desire of victory was dominant in the breast of him whose ideas were generally, and should have been now, those of patient endurance and large generosity. The fight grew closer, hotter, and more terrible. Suddenly the Prince swerved aside and fell, and within a second Heliobas held him down, pressing one knee firmly against his chest. From my point of observation, I noted with alarm that little by little Ivan ceased his violent efforts to rise, and that he kept his eyes fixed on the overshadowing face of his foe with an unnatural and curious pertinacity. I stepped forward. Heliobas pressed his whole weight heavily down on the young man's prostrate body, while with both hands he held him by the shoulders, and gazed with terrific meaning into his fast paling countenance. Ivan's lips turned blue, his eyes appeared to start from their sockets, his throat rattled. The spell that held me silent was broken. A flash of light, a flood of memory, swept over my intelligence. I knew that Heliobas was exciting the whole battery of his inner electric force, and that thus employed for the purposes of vengeance, it must infallibly cause death. I found my speech at last. "Heliobas!" I cried. "Remember, remember Azul! When death lies like a gift in your hand, withhold it! Withhold it, Heliobas, and give life instead!" He started at the sound of my voice and looked up. A strong shudder shook his frame. Very slowly, very reluctantly, he relaxed his position. He rose from his kneeling posture on the Prince's breast. He left him and stood upright. Ivan at the same moment heaved a deep sigh and closed his eyes, apparently insensible. Gradually, one by one, the hard lines faded out of the face of Heliobas, and his old expression of soft and grave beneficence came back to it as graciously as sunlight after rain. He turned to me and bent his head in a sort of reverential salutation. "I thank and bless you," he said. "You reminded me in time. Another moment and it would have been too late. You saved me." "Give him his life," I said, pointing to Ivan. "He has it," returned Heliobas. "I have not taken it from him, thank God. He provoked me. I regret it. I should have been more patient with him. He will revive immediately. I leave him to your care. In dealing with him I ought to have remembered that human passion like this, unguided by spiritual knowledge, was to be met with pity and forbearance. As it is, however, he is safe. For me, I will go and pray for Zara's pardon, and that of my wronged Azul." As he uttered the last words, he started, looked up, and smiled. "My beautiful one, thou hast pardoned me. Thou wilt love me still. Thou art with me, Azul, my beloved. I have not lost thee. O my best and dearest, wilt thou lead me? Whither? Nay, no matter whither, I come." And as one walking in sleep, he went out of the room, and I heard his footsteps echoing in the distance on the way to the chapel. Left alone with the Prince, I snatched a glass of cold water from the table, and sprinkled some of it on his forehead and hands. This was quite sufficient to revive him, and he drew a long breath, opened his eyes, and stared wildly about him. Seeing no one but me, he grew bewildered, and asked, "What has happened?" Then, catching sight of the drawn swords lying on the ground where they had been thrown, he sprang to his feet and cried, "Where is the coward and murderer?" I made him sit down and hear with patience what I had to say. I reminded him that Zara's health and happiness had always been perfect, and that her brother would rather have slain himself than her. I told him plainly that Zara had expected her death, and had prepared for it, had even bade me good bye, although then I had not understood the meaning of her words. I recalled to his mind the day when Zara had used her power to repulse him. "Disbelieve as you will in electrical spiritual force," I said, "your message to her then through me was, 'Tell her I have seen her lover.'" At these words a sombre shadow flitted over the Prince's face. "I tell you," he said slowly, "that I believe I was not on that occasion the victim of an hallucination. But I will explain to you what I saw. A superb figure, like and yet unlike a man, but of a much larger and grander form, appeared to me as I thought and spoke. 'Zara is mine,' it said, 'mine by choice, mine by free will, mine till death, mine after death, mine through eternity. With her thou hast naught in common. Thy way lies elsewhere. Follow the path allotted to thee, and presume no more upon an angel's patience.' Then this strange, majestic looking creature, whose face as I remember it was extraordinarily beautiful, and whose eyes were like self-luminous stars, vanished. But after all, what of it? The whole thing was a dream." "I am not so sure of that," I said quietly. "But, Prince Ivan, now that you are calmer and more capable of resignation, will you tell me why you loved Zara?"
"Why?" he broke out impetuously. "Why, because it was impossible to help loving her."
"That is no answer," I replied. "Think. You can reason well if you like. I have heard you hold your own in an argument. What made you love Zara?" He looked at me in a sort of impatient surprise, but seeing I was very much in earnest, he pondered a minute or so before replying.
"She was the loveliest woman I have ever seen,"
he said at last, and in his voice there was a sound of yearning and regret. "Is that all?" I queried with a gesture of contempt. "Because her body was beautiful? Because she had sweet kissing lips and soft skin? Because her hand was like a white flower, and her dark hair clustering over her brow reminded one of a misty evening cloud hiding moonlight? Because the glance of her glorious eyes made the blood leap through your veins and sting you with passionate desire? Are these the reasons of your so-called love? Oh, give it some other and lower name, for the worms shall feed on the fair flesh that won your admiration. Their wet and slimy bodies shall trail across the round white arms and tender bosom. Unsightly things shall crawl among the tresses of the glossy hair, and nothing shall remain of what you loved but dust. Prince Ivan, you shudder. But I too loved Zara. I loved her, not the perishable casket in which, like a jewel, she was forced for a time enshrined. I love her still, and for the being I love there is no such thing as death." The Prince was silent and seemed touched. I had spoken with real feeling, and tears of emotion stood in my eyes.
"I loved her as a man generally loves," he said after a little pause. "Nay, more than most men love most women."
"Most men are too often selfish in both their loves and hatreds," I returned. "Tell me if there was anything in Zara's mind and intelligence to attract you. Did you sympathize in her pursuits? Did you admire her tastes? Had you any ideas in common with her?"
"No, I confess I had not," he answered readily. "I considered her to be entirely a victim to her brother's scientific experiments. I thought by making her my wife to release her from such tyranny, and give her rescue and refuge. To this end I have found out all I could from him." He approached the name of Heliobas with reluctance. "And I made up my mind that her delicate imagination had been morbidly excited, but that marriage and a life like that led by other women would bring her to a more healthy state of mind." I smiled with a little scorn. "Your presumption was almost greater than your folly, Prince," I said. "That with such ideas as these in your mind you could dream of winning Zara for a wife? Do you think she could have led a life like that of other women?
A frivolous round of gaiety, a few fine dresses and jewels, small talk, society scandal, stale compliments, you think such things would have suited her? And would she have contented herself with a love like yours? Come, come and see how well she has escaped you." And I beckoned him towards the door. He hesitated. "Where would you take me?" he asked. "To the chapel. Zara's body lies there." He shuddered. "No, no, not there! I cannot bear to look upon her perished loveliness, to see that face, once so animated, white and rigid. Death in such a form is too horrible!" And he covered his eyes with his hand. I saw tears slowly drop through his fingers. I gazed at him, half in wonder, half in pity. "And yet you are a brave man," I said. These words roused him. He met my gaze with such a haggard look of woe that my heart ached for him. What comfort had he now? What joy could he ever expect? All his happiness was centered in the fact of being alive, alive to the pleasures of living and to the joys the world could offer to a man who was strong, handsome, rich, and accomplished. How could he look upon death as otherwise than a loathsome thing, a thing not to be thought of in the heyday of youthful blood and jollity, a doleful spectre, in whose bony hands the roses of love must fall and wither? With a sense of deep commiseration in me, I spoke again with great gentleness. "You need not look upon Zara's corpse unless you wish it, Prince," I said. "To you the mysteries of the hereafter have not been unlocked, because there is something in your nature that cannot and will not believe in God. Therefore to you death must be repellent. I know you are one of those for whom the present alone exists. You easily forget the past and take no trouble for the future. Paris is your heaven, or St. Petersburg, or Vienna, as the fancy takes you, and the modern atheistical doctrines of French demoralization are in your blood. Nothing but a heaven sent miracle could make you other than you are, and miracles do not exist for the materialist. But let me say 2 words more before you go from this house. Seek no more to avenge yourself for your love disappointment on Heliobas, for you have really nothing to avenge. By your own confession, you only cared for Zara's body. That body was always perishable, and it has perished by a sudden but natural catastrophe. With her soul you declare you had nothing in common. That was herself, and she is alive to us who love her as she sought to be loved. Heliobas is innocent of having slain her body. He but helped to cultivate and foster that beautiful spirit which he knew to be her. For that he is to be honoured and commended. Promise me, therefore, Prince Ivan, that you will never approach him again except in friendship. Indeed, you owe him an apology for your unjust accusation, as also your gratitude for his sparing your life in the recent struggle." The Prince kept his eyes steadily fixed upon me all the time I was speaking, and as I finished he sighed and moved restlessly. "Your words are compelling, mademoiselle," he said, "and you have a strange attraction for me. I know I am not wrong in thinking that you are a disciple of Heliobas, whose science I admit, though I doubt his theories. I promise you willingly what you ask. Nay, I will even offer him my hand if he will accept it." Overjoyed at my success, I answered, "He is in the chapel, but I will fetch him here." Over the Prince's face a shadow of doubt mingled with dread passed swiftly, and he seemed to be forming a resolve in his own mind which was more or less distasteful to him. Whatever the firmness was, he conquered it by a strong effort, and said with firmness: "No, I will go to him myself, and I will look again upon the face I loved. It is but one pang the more, and why should I not endure it?" Seeing him thus inclined, I made no effort to dissuade him, and without another word I led the way to the chapel. I entered it reverently. He followed me closely, with slow, hushed footsteps. All was the same as I had left it, save that the servants of the household had gone to take some needful rest before the morning light called them to their daily routine of labour. Father Paul, too, had retired, and Heliobas alone knelt beside all that remained of Zara, his figure as motionless as though carved in bronze, his face hidden in his hands. As we approached he neither stirred nor looked up. Therefore I softly led the Prince to the opposite side of the bier, that he might look quietly on the perished loveliness that lay there at rest for ever. Ivan trembled, yet steadfastly gazed at the beautiful reposeful form, at the calm features on which the smile with which death had been received still lingered, at the folded hands, the fading orange blossoms, at the crucifix that lay on the cold breast like the final seal on the letter of life. Impulsively he stooped forward, and with a tender awe pressed his lips on the pale forehead, but instantly started back with the smothered exclamation, "Oh God, how cold!" End of section 29. Section 30 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Part 2. A Struggle for the Mastery. At the sound of his voice, Heliobas rose up erect, and the two men faced each other, Zara's dead body lying like a barrier betwixt them. A pause followed, a pause in which I heard my own heart beating loudly, so great was my anxiety. Heliobas suffered a few moments to elapse, then stretched his hand across his sister's bier. "In her name, let there be peace between us, Ivan," he said in accents that were both gentle and solemn. The Prince, touched to the quick, responded to these kindly words with eager promptness, and they clasped hands over the quiet and lovely form that lay there, a silent binding witness of their reconciliation. "I have to ask your pardon, Casimir," then whispered Ivan. "I have also to thank you for my life." "Thank the friend who stands beside you," returned Heliobas in the same low tone, with a slight gesture towards me. "She reminded me of a duty in time. As for pardon, I know of no cause of offence on your part, save what was perfectly excusable. Say no more. Wisdom comes with years, and you are yet young." A long silence followed. We all remained looking wistfully down upon the body of our lost darling, in thought too deep for words or weeping. I then noticed that another humble mourner shared our watch, a mourner whose very existence I had nearly forgotten. It was the faithful Leo. He lay couchant on the stone floor at the foot of the bier, almost as silent as a dog of marble, the only sign of animation he gave being a deep sigh which broke from his honest heart now and then. I went to him and softly patted his shaggy coat. He looked up at me with big brown eyes full of tears, licked my hand meekly, and again laid his head down upon his two forepaws with a resignation that was most pathetic. The dawn began to peer faintly through the chapel windows, the dawn of a misty, chilly morning. The storm of the past night had left a sting in the air, and the rain still fell, though gently. The wind had almost entirely sunk into silence. I rearranged the flowers that were strewn on Zara's corpse, taking away all those that had slightly faded. The orange blossom was almost dead, but I left that where it was, where the living Zara had herself placed it. As I performed this slight service, I thought half mournfully, half gladly, "Yes, heaven is thine, but this is a world of sweets and sours. Our flowers are merely flowers, and the shadow of thy perfect bliss is the sunshine of ours." Prince Ivan at last roused himself as from a deep and melancholy reverie, and addressing himself to Heliobas, said softly: "I will intrude no longer on your privacy, Casimir. Farewell. I shall leave Paris to-night." For all answer Heliobas beckoned him, and we also out of the chapel. As soon as its doors closed behind us and we stood in the centre hall, he spoke with affectionate and grave earnestness: "Ivan, something tells me that you and I shall not meet again for many years, if ever. Therefore, when you say farewell, the words fall upon my ears with double meaning. We are friends. Our friendship is sanctified by the dead presence of one whom we both loved in different ways. Therefore, you will take in good part what I say now to you. You know, you cannot disguise from yourself that the science I study is fraught with terrible truth and marvelous discoveries. The theories I deduce from it you disbelieve, because you are nearly a materialist. I say nearly, not quite. That not quite makes me love you, Ivan. I would save the small bright spark that flickers within you from both escape and extinction, but I cannot, at least not as yet. Still, in order that you may know that there is a power in me higher than ordinary human reason, before you go from me to-night, hear my prophecy of your career. The world waits for you, Ivan, the world,
all agape and glittering with 1,000 sparkling toys. It waits greedy for your presence, ready to fawn upon you for a smile, willing to cringe to you for a nod of approval. And why? Because wealth is yours, vast, illimitable wealth. Aye, you need not start or look incredulous. You will find it as I say. You whose fortune up to now has barely reached a poor 4,000 per annum, you are at this moment the possessor of millions. Only last night a relative of yours, whose name you scarcely know, expired, leaving all his hoarded treasures to you. Before the close of this present day, on whose threshold we now stand, you will have the news. When you receive it, remember me, and acknowledge that at least for once I knew and spoke the truth. Follow the broad road, Ivan, laid out before you, a road wide enough not only for you to walk in, but for the crowd of toadies and flatterers also, who will push on swiftly after you and jostle you on all sides. Be strong of heart and merry of countenance. Gather the roses, press the luscious grapes into warm red wine, that as you quaff it, shall make your blood dance a mad waltz in your veins, and fair women's faces shall seem fairer to you than ever, their embraces more tender, their kisses more tempting. Spin the ball of society like a toy in the palm of your hand. I see your life stretching before me like a brilliant, thread-like, ephemeral ray of light. But in the far distance across it looms a shadow that your power alone can lift. Mark me, Ivan. When the first dread chill of that shadow makes itself felt, come to me. I shall yet be living. Come, for then no wealth can aid you. At that dark hour no boon companions can comfort. Come, and by our friendship so lately sworn, by Zara's pure soul, by God's existence, I will not die till I have changed that darkness over you into light eternal. Fare you well." He caught the Prince's hand and wrung it hard, then without further word, look, or gesture, turned and disappeared again within the chapel. His words had evidently made a deep impression on the young nobleman, who gazed after his retreating figure with a certain awe not unmingled with fear. I held out my hand in silent farewell. Ivan took it gently and kissed it with graceful courtesy. "Casimir told me that your intercession saved my life, mademoiselle," he said. "Accept my poor thanks. If his present prophet-like utterances be true—" "Why should you doubt him?" I asked with some impatience. "Can you believe in nothing?" The Prince, still holding my hand, looked at me in a sort of grave perplexity. "I think you have hit it," he observed quietly. "I doubt everything except the fact of my own existence, and there are times when I am not even sure of that. But if, as I said before, the prophecy of my Chaldean friend, whom I cannot help admiring with all my heart, turns out to be correct, then my life is more valuable to me than ever, with such wealth to balance it, and I thank you doubly for having saved it by a word in time." I withdrew my hand gently from his. "You think the worth of your life increased by wealth?" I asked. "Naturally. Money is power." "And what of the shadow also foretold as inseparable from your fate?" A faint smile crossed his features. "Ah, pardon me! That is the only portion of Casimir's fortune telling that I am inclined to disbelieve thoroughly." "But," I said, "if you are willing to accept the pleasant part of his prophecy, why not admit the possibility of the unpleasant occurring also?" He shrugged his shoulders. "In these enlightened times, mademoiselle, we only believe what is agreeable to us, and what suits our own wishes, tastes, and opinions. Ça va sans dire. We cannot be forced to accept a deity against our reason. That is a grand result of modern education." "Is it?" And I looked at him with pity. "Poor human reason! It will reel into madness sometimes for a mere trifle. An overdose of alcohol will sometimes upset it altogether. What a noble, omnipotent thing is human reason! But let me not detain you. Good bye, and as the greeting of olden times used to run, God save you." He bent his head with a light reverence. "I believe you to be a good, sweet woman," he said. "Therefore I am grateful for your blessing. My mother," and here his eyes grew dreamy and wistful, "poor soul, she died long ago. My mother would never let me retire to rest without signing the cross on my brow. Ah well, that is past. I should like mademoiselle," and his voice sank very low, "to send some flowers for her. You understand?" I did understand, and readily promised to lay whatever blossoms he selected tenderly above the sacred remains of that earthly beauty he had loved, as he himself said, more than most men love most women. He thanked me earnestly, and seemed relieved and satisfied. Casting a look of farewell around the familiar hall, he wafted a parting kiss towards the chapel, an action which, though light, was full of tenderness and regret. Then, with a low salute, he left me. The street door opened and closed after him in its usual noiseless manner. He was gone. The morning had now fairly dawned, and within the Hotel Mars the work of the great mansion went on in its usual routine. But a sombre melancholy was in the atmosphere, a melancholy that not all my best efforts could dissipate. The domestics looked sullen and heavy eyed. The only ones in their number who persevered their usual equanimity were the Armenian men servants and the little Greek page. Preparations for Zara's funeral went on apace. They were exceedingly simple, and the ceremony was to be quite private in character. Heliobas issued his orders, and saw to the carrying out of his most minute instructions in his usual calm manner. But his eyes looked heavy, and his fine countenance was rendered even more majestic by the sacred, resigned sorrow that lay upon it like a deep shadow. His page served him with breakfast in his private room, but he left the light meal untasted. One of the women brought me coffee, but the very thought of eating and drinking seemed repulsive, and I could not touch anything. My mind was busy with the consideration of the duty I had to perform, namely, to see the destruction of Zara's colossal statue, as she had requested. After thinking about it for some time, I went to Heliobas and told him what I had it in charge to do. He listened attentively. "Do it at once," he said decisively. "Take my Armenians; they are discreet, obedient, and they ask no questions. With strong hammers they will soon crush the clay. Stay, I will come with you." Then, looking at me scrutinizingly, he added kindly, "You have eaten nothing, my child? You cannot, but your strength will give way. Here, take this." And he held out a small glass of a fluid whose reviving properties I well knew to be greater than any sustenance provided by an ordinary meal. I swallowed it obediently, and as I returned the empty glass to him, he said: "I also have a commission in charge from Zara. You know, I suppose, that she was prepared for her death?" "I did not know, but I think she must have been," I answered. "She was. We both were. We remained together in the chapel all day, saying what parting words we had to say to one another. We knew her death, or rather her release, was to occur at some hour that night, but in what way the end was destined to come we knew not. Till I heard the first peals of thunder I was in suspense, but after that I was no longer uncertain. You are a witness of the whole ensuing scene. No death could have been more painless than hers. But let me not forget the message she gave me for you." Here he took from a secret drawer the electric stone Zara had always worn. "This jewel is yours," he said. "You need not fear to accept it. It contains no harm. It will bring you no ill fortune. You see how all the sparkling brilliancy has gone out of it. Wear it, and within a few minutes it will be as lustrous as ever. The life throbbing in your veins warms the electricity containing in it, and with the flowing of your blood its hues change and glow. It has no power to attract; it can simply absorb and shine. Take it as a remembrance of her who loved you and who loves you still." I was still in my evening dress, and my neck was bare. I slipped the chain on which hung the stone round my throat, and watched the strange gem with some curiosity. In a few seconds a pale streak of fiery topaz flashed through it, which deepened and glowed into a warm crimson, like the heart of a red rose, and by the time it had become thoroughly warmed against my flesh, it glittered as brilliantly as ever. "I will always wear it," I said earnestly. "I believe it will bring me good fortune." "I believe it will," returned Heliobas simply. And now let us fulfill Zara's other commands." On our way across the hall we were stopped by the page, who brought us a message of inquiry after Zara's health from Colonel Everard and his wife, and also from the Challoners. Heliobas hastily wrote a few brief words in pencil, explaining the fatal result of the accident, and returned it to the messenger, giving orders at the same time that all the blinds should be pulled down at the windows of the house, that visitors might understand there was no admittance. We then proceeded to the studio, accompanied by the Armenians carrying heavy hammers. Reverently, and with my mind full of recollections of Zara's living presence, I opened the familiar door. The first thing that greeted us was a most exquisitely wrought statue in white marble of Zara herself, full length and arrayed in her customary graceful Eastern costume. The head was slightly raised. A look of gladness lighted up the beautiful features, and within the loosely clasped hands was a cluster of roses. Round the pedestal were carved the words "Omnia vincit amor," with Zara's name and the dates of her birth and death. A little slip of paper lay at the foot of the statue, which Heliobas perceived, and taking it he read and passed it to me. The lines were in Zara's handwriting, and ran as follows: "To my beloved Casimir, my brother, my friend, my guide and teacher, to whom I owe the supreme happiness of my life in this world and the next, let this poor figure of his grateful Zara be a memento of happy days that are gone, only to be renewed with redoubled happiness hereafter." I handed back the paper silently, with tears in my eyes, and we turned our attention to the colossal figure we had come to destroy. It stood at the extreme end of the studio, and was entirely hidden by white linen drapery. Heliobas advanced, and by a sudden dexterous movement succeeded in drawing off the coverings with a single effort, and then we both fell back and gazed at the clay form disclosed in amazement. What did it present? A man, a god, an angel, or all three united in one vast figure? It was an unfinished work. The features of the face were undeclared, save the brow and eyes, and these were large, grand, and full of absolute wisdom and tranquil consciousness of power. I could have gazed on this wonderful piece of Zara's handiwork for hours, but Heliobas called to the Armenian servants, who stood near the door awaiting orders, and commanded them to break it down. For once these well-trained domestics showed signs of surprise and hesitated. Their master frowned. Snatching a hammer from one of them, he himself attacked the great statue as if it were a personal foe. The Armenians, seeing he was in earnest, returned to their usual habits of passive obedience, and aided him in his labour. Within a few minutes the great and beautiful figure lay in fragments on the floor, and these fragments were soon crushed into indistinguishable atoms. I had promised to witness this work of destruction, and witness it I did, but it was with pain and regret. When all was finished, Heliobas commanded his men to carry the statue of Zara's self down to his own private room, and then to summon all the domestics of the household in a body to the great hall, as he wished to address them. I heard him give this order with some surprise, and he saw it, as the Armenians slowly disappeared, carrying with great care the marble figure of their late mistress. He turned to me as he locked up the door of the studio, and said quietly: "These ignorant folk who serve me for money and food, money that they have eagerly taken, and food that they have greedily devoured, they think that I am the devil or one of the devil's agents, and I am going to prove their theories entirely to their satisfaction. Come and see." I followed him somewhat mystified. On the way downstairs he said: "Do you know why Zara wished that statue destroyed?" "No," I said frankly, "unless for the reason that it was incomplete." "It always would have been incomplete," returned Heliobas, "even had she lived to work at it for years. It was a daring attempt, and a fruitless one. She was trying to make a clay figure of one who never wore earthly form, the being who is her twin soul, who dominates her entirely, and who is with her now. As well might she have tried to represent in white marble the prismatic hues of the rainbow." Section 30.
Section 31 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Part 3. A Struggle for the Mastery. We had now reached the hall, and the servants were assembling by twos and threes. They glanced at their master with looks of awe as he took up a commanding position near the fountain, and faced them with a glance of calm scrutiny and attention. I drew a chair behind one of the marble columns and seated myself, watching everything with interest. Leo appeared from some corner or other, and laid his rough body down close at his master's feet. In a few minutes all the domestics, some 20 in number, were present, and Heliobas, raising his voice, spoke with a clear, deliberate enunciation.
"I have sent for you all this morning because I am perfectly aware that you have all determined to give me notice."
A stir of astonishment and dismay ensued on the part of the small audience, and I heard one voice near me whisper, "He is the devil, or how could he have known it?" The lips of Heliobas curled in a fine sarcastic smile. He went on:
"I spare you this trouble. Knowing your intentions, I take upon myself to dismiss you at once. Naturally, you cannot risk your characters by remaining in the service of the devil. For my own part, I wonder the devil's money has not burnt your hands, or his food turned to poison in your mouths. My sister, your kind and ever indulgent mistress, is dead. You know this, and it's your opinion that I summoned up the thunderstorm which caused her death. Be it so. Report it so, if you will, through Paris. Your words do not affect me. You have been excellent machines, and for your services many thanks. As soon as my sister's funeral is over, your wages, with an additional present, will be sent to you. You can then leave my house when you please, and contrary to the usual custom of accepted devils, I am able to say, without perishing in the effort, God speed you all."
The faces of those he addressed exhibited various emotions while he spoke, fear contending with a good deal of shame. The little Greek page stepped forward timidly. "The master knows that I will never leave him," he murmured, and his large eyes were moist with tears. Heliobas laid a gentle hand on the boy's dark curls, but said nothing. One of the 4 Armenians advanced, and with a graceful, rapid gesture of his right hand, touched his head and breast. "My lord will surely not dismiss us who desire to devote ourselves to his service. We are willing to follow my lord to the death if need be, for the sake of the love and honour we bear him." Heliobas looked at him very kindly. "I am richer in friends than I thought myself to be," he said quietly. "Stay then by all means, Afra, you and your companions, since you have desired it. And you, my boy," he went on, addressing the tearful page, "think you that I would turn adrift an orphan whom a dying mother trusted to my care? Nay, child, I am as much your servant as you are mine, so long as your love turns towards me." For all answer the page kissed his hand in a sort of rapture, and flinging back his clustering hair from his classic brows, surveyed the domestics, who had taken their dismissal in silent acquiescence, with a pretty scorn. "Go, all of you scum of Paris!" he cried in his clear treble tones. "You who know neither God nor devil! You will have your money, more than your share. What else seek you? You have served one of the noblest of men, and because he's so great and wise and true, you judge him a fiend. Oh, so like the people of Paris, they who pervert all things till they think good evil and evil good. Look you, you have worked for your wages, but I have worked for him. I would starve with him, I would die for him, for to me he is not fiend, but angel." Overcome by his own feelings, the boy again kissed his master's hand, and Heliobas gently bade him be silent. He himself looked round on the still motionless group of servants with an air of calm surprise.
"What are you waiting for?" he asked. "Consider yourselves dismissed, and at liberty to go where you please. Any one of you that chooses to apply to me for a character shall not lack the suitable recommendation. There is no more to say."
A lively looking woman, with quick restless black eyes, stepped forward. "I am sure," she said with a mincing curtsy, "that we are very sorry if we have unintentionally wronged monsieur, but monsieur, who is aware of so many things, must know that many reports are circulated about monsieur that makes one to shudder. That madame, his sister's death, so lamentable has given to all, what one would say, the horrors, and monsieur must consider that poor servants of virtuous reputation—"
"So, Jean Claudette," interrupted Heliobas in a thrilling low tone, "and what of the child, the little waxen faced helpless babe, left to die on the banks of the Loire? But it did not die, Jeanne, and it was rescued, and it shall live to loathe its mother." The woman uttered a shriek and fainted. In the feminine confusion and fuss that ensued, Heliobas, accompanied by his little page and the dog Leo, left the hall, and entered his own private room, where for some time I left him undisturbed. In the early part of the afternoon a note was brought to me. It was from Colonel Everard, entreating me to come as soon as possible to his wife, who was very ill. "Since she heard of the death of that beautiful young lady, a death so fearfully sudden and unexpected," wrote the Colonel, "she has been quite unlike herself, nervous, hysterical, and thoroughly unstrung. It will be a real kindness to her if you will come as soon as you can. She has such a strong desire for your company."
I showed this note at once to Heliobas. He read it and said:
"Of course you must go. Wait till our simple funeral ceremony is over, and then we part. Not forever. I shall see you often again, for now I have lost Zara. You are my only female disciple, and I shall not willingly lose sight of you. You will correspond with me?"
"Gladly and gratefully," I replied.
"You shall not lose by it. I can initiate you into many secrets that will be useful to you in your career. As for your friend Mrs. Everard, you will find that your presence will cure her. You have progressed greatly in electric force. The mere touch of your hand will soothe her, as you will find. But never be tempted to try any of the fluids of which you have recipes on her, or on anybody but yourself, unless you write to me first about it, as Cellini did when he tried an experiment on you. As for your own bodily and spiritual health, you know thoroughly what to do. Keep the secret, and make a step in advance every day. By and by you will have double work."
"How so?" I asked.
"In Zara's case, her soul became dominated by a spirit whose destiny was fulfilled and perfect, and who never could descend to imprisonment in earthly clay. Now you will not be dominated, you will be simply equalized. That is, you will find the exact counterpart of your own soul dwelling also in human form, and you will have to impart your own force to that other soul, which will in its turn impart to yours a corresponding electrical impetus. There is no union so lovely as such an one, no harmony so exquisite. It is like a perfect chord, complete and indissoluble. There are sevenths and ninths in music, beautiful and effective in their degrees, but perhaps none of them are so absolutely satisfying to the ear as the perfect chord. And this is your lot in life and in love, my child. Be grateful for it night and morning on your bended knees before the Giver of all good, and walk warily. Your own soul, with that other, shall need much thought and humble prayer. Aim onward and upward. You know the road. You also know, and you have partly seen, what awaits you at the end."
After this conversation we spoke no more in private together. The rest of the afternoon was entirely occupied with the final preparations for Zara's funeral, which was to take place at Père Lachaise early the next morning. A large and beautiful wreath of white roses, lilies, and maidenhair arrived from Prince Ivan, and remembering my promise to him, I went myself to lay it in a conspicuous place on Zara's corpse. That fair body was now laid in its coffin of polished oak, and a delicate veil of filmy lace draped it from head to foot. The placid expression of the features remained unchanged, save for a little extra rigidity of the flesh. The hands folded over the crucifix were stiff, and looked as though they were moulded in wax. I placed the wreath in position and paused, looking wistfully at that still and solemn figure. Father Paul, slowly entering from a side door, came and stood beside me. "She is happy," he said, and a cheerful expression irradiated his venerable features. "Did you also know she would die that night?" I asked softly.
"Her brother sent for me and told me of her expected dissolution. She herself told me, and made her last confession and communion. Therefore I was prepared."
"But did you not doubt, were you not inclined to think, they might be wrong?" I inquired with some astonishment.
"I knew Heliobas as a child," the priest returned. "I knew his father and mother before him, and I have been always perfectly aware of the immense extent of his knowledge and the value of his discoveries. If I were inclined to be sceptical on spiritual matters, I should not be of the race I am, for I am also a Chaldean."
I said no more, and Father Paul trimmed the tapers burning round the coffin in devout silence. Again I looked at the fair dead form before me, but somehow I could not feel sad again. All my impulses bade me rejoice. Why should I be unhappy on Zara's account, more especially when the glories of the Central Sphere were yet fresh in my memory, and when I knew as a positive fact that her happiness was now perfect? I left the chapel with a light step and lighter heart, and went to my own room to pack up my things, that all might be in readiness for my departure on the morrow. On my table I found a volume whose quaint binding I at once recognized, "The Letters of a Dead Musician." A card lay beside it, on which was written in pencil:
"Knowing of your wish to possess this book, I herewith offer it for your acceptance. It teaches you a cheerful devotion to art, and an indifference to the world's opinions, both of which are necessary to you in your career. Heliobas."
Delighted with this gift, I opened the book, and found my name written on the fly leaf, with the date of the month and year, and the words: "La musica e il lamento dell'amore, o la preghiera agli dei." Music is the lament of love, or a prayer to the gods. I placed this treasure carefully in a corner of my portmanteau, together with the parchment scrolls containing the electric principle of Christianity, and the valuable recipes of Heliobas; and as I did so I caught sight of myself in the long mirror that directly faced me. I was fascinated, not by my own reflection, but by the glitter of the electric gem I wore. It flashed and glowed like a star, and was really lovely, far more brilliant than the most brilliant cluster of fine diamonds. I may here remark that I have been asked many questions concerning this curious ornament, whenever I have worn it in public, and the general impression has been that it is some new arrangement of ornamental electricity. It is, however, nothing of the kind. It is simply a clear pebble, common enough on the shores of tropical countries, which has the property of absorbing a small portion of the electricity in a human body, sufficient to make it shine with prismatic and powerful lustre, a property which has only as yet been discovered by Heliobas, who asserts that the same capability exists in many other apparently lustreless stones which have been untried, and are therefore unknown. The healing stones or amulets still in use in the East, and also in the remote parts of the Highlands (see notes to Archibald Clerk's translation of Ossian), are also electric, but in a different way. They have the property of absorbing disease and destroying it in certain cases, and these, after being worn a suitable length of time, naturally exhaust what virtue they originally possessed, and are no longer of any use. Stone amulets are considered nowadays as a mere superstition of the vulgar and uneducated, but it must be remembered that superstition itself has always had for it a foundation, some grain, however small and remote, of fact. I could give a very curious explanation of the formation of orchids, those strange plants called sometimes freaks of nature, as if nature ever indulged in a freak of any kind. But I have neither time nor space to enter upon the subject now. Indeed, if I were once to begin to describe the wonderful, amazing, and beautiful vistas of knowledge that the wise Chaldean, who is still my friend and guide, has opened up and continued to extend before my admiring vision, a work of 20 volumes would scarce contain all I should have to say. But I have written this book merely to tell those who peruse it about Heliobas, and what I myself experienced in his house. Beyond this I may not go, for, as I observed in my introduction, I am perfectly aware that few, if any, of my readers will accept my narrative as more than a mere visionary romance, or that they will admit the mysteries of life, death, eternity, and all the wonders of the universe to be simply the natural and scientific outcome of a ring of everlasting electric heat and light. But whether they agree to it or no, I can say with Galileo, "E pursi muovi." End of section 31. Section 32 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Part 1, Conclusion. It was a very simple and quiet procession that moved next day from the Hotel Mars to Père Lachaise. Zara's coffin was carried in an open hearse, and was covered with a pall of rich white velvet, on which lay a royal profusion of flowers, Ivan's wreath, and a magnificent cross of lilies sent by tender-hearted Mrs. Challoner being most conspicuous among them. The only thing a little unusual about it was that the funeral car was drawn by two stately white horses, and Heliobas told me this had been ordered at Zara's special request, as she thought the solemn pacing through the streets of dismal black steeds had a depressing effect on the passers-by. "And why," she had said, "should anybody be sad when I in reality am so thoroughly happy?" Prince Ivan Petrovsky had left Paris, but his carriage, drawn by two prancing Russian steeds, followed the hearse at a respectful distance, as also the carriage of Dr. Morini and some other private persons known to Heliobas. A few people attended it on foot, and these were chiefly from among the very poor, some of whom had benefited by Zara's charity or her brother's medical skill, and had heard of the calamity through rumour or through the columns of the Figaro, where it was reported with graphic brevity. The weather was still misty, and the fiery sun seemed to shine through tears as Father Paul, with his assistants, read in solemn yet cheerful tones the service for the dead according to Catholic ritual. One of the chief mourners at the grave was the faithful Leo, who, without obtruding himself in any one's way, sat a little distance, and seemed, by the confiding look with which he turned his eyes upon his master, to thoroughly understand that he must henceforth devote his life entirely to him alone. The coffin was lowered, the Requiem Aeternam spoken, all was over. Those assembled shook hands quietly with Heliobas, saluted each other, and gradually dispersed. I entered a carriage and drove back to the Hotel Mars, leaving Heliobas in the cemetery to give his final instructions for the ornamentation and decoration of his sister's grave. The little page served me with some luncheon in my own apartment, and by the time all was ready for my departure, Heliobas returned. I went down to him in his study, and found him sitting pensively in his armchair, absorbed in thought. He looked sad and solitary, and my whole heart went out to him in gratitude and sympathy. I knelt beside him as a daughter might have done, and softly kissed his hand. He started as though awakened suddenly from sleep, and seeing me his eyes softened, and he smiled gravely. "Are you come to say good bye, my child?" he asked in a kind tone. "Well, your mission here is ended." "Had I a mission at all?" I replied with a grateful look, "save the very selfish one which was compromised in the natural desire to be restored to health?" Heliobas surveyed me for a few minutes in silence. "Were I to tell you," he said at last, "by what mystical authority and influence you were compelled to come here, by what a marvellously linked chain of circumstances you became known to me long before I saw you, how I was made aware that you were the only woman living to whose companionship I could trust my sister at a time when the society of one of her own sex became absolutely necessary to her, how you were marked out to me as a small point of light by which possibly I might steer my course clear of the darkness which threatened me, I say, were I to tell you all this, you would no longer doubt the urgent need of your presence here. It is, however, enough to tell you that you have fulfilled all that was expected of you, even beyond my best hopes, and in return for your services, the worth of which you cannot realize, whatever guidance I can give you in the future for your physical and spiritual life is yours. I have done something for you, but not much. I will do more. Only, in communicating with me, I ask you to honour me with your full confidence in all matters pertaining to yourself and your surroundings. Then I shall not be liable to errors of judgment in the opinions I form or the advice I give." "I promise most readily," I replied gladly, for it seemed to me that I was rich in possessing as a friend and a counsellor such a man as this student of the loftiest sciences.
"And now one more thing," he resumed, opening a drawer in the table near which I sat. "Here is a pencil for you to write your letters to me with. It will last about 10 years, and at the expiration of that time you can have another. Write with it on any paper, and the marks will be like those of an ordinary drawing pencil, but as fast as they are written they disappear. Trouble not about this circumstance. Write all you have to say, and when you have finished your letter your closely covered pages shall seem blank. Therefore, were the eye of a stranger to look at them, nothing could be learned therefrom. But when they reach me, I can make the writing appear and stand out on these apparently unsullied pages as distinctly as though your words had been printed. My letters to you will also, when you receive them, appear blank, but you will only have to press them for about 10 minutes in this," and he handed me what looked like an ordinary blotting book, "and they will be perfectly legible. Cellini has these little writing implements. He uses them whenever the distances are too great for us to amuse ourselves with the sagacity of Leo. In fact, the journeys of that faithful animal have principally been to keep him in training." "But," I said as I took the pencil and book from his hand, "why do you not make these convenient writing materials public property? They would be so useful." "Why should I build up a fortune for some needy stationer?" he asked with a half smile. "Besides, they are not new things. They were known to the ancients, and many secret letters, laws, histories, and poems were written with instruments such as these. In an old library destroyed more than 2 centuries ago there was a goodly pile of apparently blank parchment. Had I lived then and known what I know now, I could have made the white pages declare their mystery." "Has this also to do with electricity?" I asked. "Certainly, with what is called vegetable electricity. There is not a plant or herb in existence but has almost a miracle hidden away in its tiny cup or spreading leaves. Do you doubt it?"
"Not I," I answered quickly. "I doubt nothing." Heliobas smiled gravely.
"You are right," he said. "Doubt is the destroyer of beauty, the poison in the sweet cup of existence, the curse which mankind have brought on themselves. Avoid it as you would the plague. Believe in anything or everything miraculous and glorious. The utmost reach of your faith can with difficulty grasp the majestic reality and perfection of everything you can see, desire, or imagine. Mistrust that volatile thing called human reason, which is merely a name for whatever opinion we happen to adopt for time. It is a thing which totters on its throne in a fit of rage or despair. There is nothing infinite about it. Guide yourself by the delicate spiritual instinct within you, which tells you that with God all things are possible, save that He cannot destroy Himself, or lessen by one spark the fiery brilliance of His ever widening circle of productive intelligence. But make no attempt to convert the world to your way of thinking. It would be mere waste of time."
"May I never trust to instruct anyone in these things?" I asked.
"You can try if you choose, but you will find most human beings like the herd of swine in the Gospel, possessed by devils that drive them headlong into the sea. You know, for instance, that angels and aerial spirits actually exist. But were you to assert your belief in them, philosophers, so called, would scout your theories as absurd. Though their ideas of a lonely God, who yet is love, is the very acme of absurdity. For love must have somewhat to love, and must create the beauty and happiness round itself, and the things beloved. But why point out these simple things to those who have no desire to see? Be content, child, that you have been deemed worthy of instruction. It is a higher fate for you than if you had been made a queen." The little page now entered, and told me that the carriage was at the door in waiting. As he disappeared again after delivering this message, Heliobas rose from his chair, and taking my 2 hands in his, pressed them kindly. "One more word, little friend, on the subject of your career. I think the time will come when you will feel that music is almost too sacred a thing to be given away for money to a careless and promiscuous public. However this may be, remember that scarce one of the self-styled artists who cater for the crowd deserves to be called musician in the highest sense of the word. Most of them seek not music, but money and applause, and therefore the art they profess is degraded by them into a mere trade. But you, when you play in public, must forget that persons with little vanities and lesser opinions exist. Think of what you saw in your journey with Azul, and by a strong effort of your will you can, if you choose, compel certain harmonies to sound in your ears, fragments of what is common breathing air to the children of the Ring, some of whom you saw, and will be able to reproduce them in part, if not in entirety. But if you once admit a thought of self to enter your brain, those aerial sounds will be silenced instantly. By this means, too, you can judge who are the true disciples of music in this world: those who, like Schubert and Chopin, suffer the heavy worn melodies to descend through them as though they were mere conductors of sound, or those who, feebly imitating other composers, measured out crotchets and quavers by rule and line, and flood the world with inane and perishable and therefore useless productions. And now, farewell."
"Do you remain in Paris?" I asked.
"For a few days only. I shall go to Egypt, and in travelling accustom myself to the solitude in which I must dwell, now Zara has left me."
"You have Azul," I ventured to remark.
"Ah, but how often do I see her! Only when my soul for an instant is clear from all earthly and gross obstruction. And how seldom I can attain to this result while weighted with my body! But she is near me, that I know, faithful as the star to the mariner's compass." He raised his head as he spoke, and his eyes flashed. Never had I seen him look more noble or kingly. The inspired radiance of his face softened down into his usual expression of gentleness and courtesy, and he said, offering me his arm: "Let me see you to the carriage. You know it is not an actual parting with us. I intend that we shall meet frequently. For instance, the next time we exchange pleasant greetings will be in Italy."
I suppose I looked surprised. I certainly felt so, for nothing was further from my thoughts than a visit to Italy. Heliobas smiled and said in a tone that was almost gay:
"Shall I draw the picture for you? I see a fair city, deep, embowered in hills and sheltered by olive groves. Over it beams a broad sky, deeply blue. Many soft bells caress the summer air. Away in the Cascine woods a gay party of people are seated on the velvety moss. They have mandolins, and they sing for pure gaiety of heart. One of them, a woman with fair hair arrayed in white, with a red rose at her bosom, is gathering the wild flowers that bloom around her, and weaving them into posies for her companions. A stranger, pacing slowly, book in hand, through the shady avenue, sees her. Her eyes meet his. She springs up to greet him. He takes her hand. The woman is yourself; the stranger no other than your poor friend, who now, for a brief space, takes leave of you." So rapidly had he drawn up this picture that the impression made on me was as though a sudden vision had been shown to me in a magic glass. I looked at him earnestly. "Then our next meeting will be happy?" I said inquiringly. "Of course, why not? And the next after that also," he answered.
At this reply, so frankly given, I was relieved, and accompanied him readily through the hall towards the street door. Leo met us here, and intimated, as plainly as a human being could have done, his wish to bid me good bye. I stooped and kissed his broad head and patted him affectionately, and was rewarded for these attentions by seeing his plume-like tail wave slowly to and fro, a sign of pleasure the poor animal had not betrayed since Zara's departure from the scene of her earthly imprisonment. At the door the pretty Greek boy handed me a huge basket of the loveliest flowers.
"The last from the conservatory," said Heliobas. "I shall need no more of these luxuries."
As I entered the carriage he placed the flowers beside me, and again took my hand.
"Good bye, my child," he said in earnest and kindly tones. "I have your address, and will write you all my movements. In any trouble, small or great, of your own, send to me for advice without hesitation. I can tell you already that I foresee the time when you will resign altogether the precarious and unsatisfactory life of a mere professional musician. You think no other career would be possible to you? Well, you will see. A few months will decide all. Goodbye again. God bless you.
End of Section 32. Read by Amy Gramour of Holton, Maine, 2012. amysmindtoyourmind.com. Section 33 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, Part 2, Conclusion. The carriage moved off, and Heliobas stood on the steps of his mansion, watching it out of sight. To the last I saw his stately figure erect in the light of the winter sunshine, a figure destined from henceforth to occupy a prominent position in my life and memory. The regret I felt at parting from him was greatly mitigated by the assurance he gave me of our future meeting, a promise which has since been fulfilled and is likely soon to be fulfilled again. That I have such a friend is an advantageous circumstance for me, for through his guidance I am able to judge accurately of many things occurring in the course of the daily life around me, things which, seemingly trivial, are the hints of serious results to come, which I am thus permitted in part to foresee. There is a drawback, of course, and the one bitter drop in the cup of knowledge is that the more I progress under the tuition of Heliobas, the less am I deceived by graceful appearances. I perceive with almost cruel suddenness the true characters of all those whom I meet. No smile of lip or eye can delude me into accepting mere surface matter for real depth, and it is intensely painful for me to be forced to behold hypocrisy in the expression of the apparently devout, sensuality in the face of some radiantly beautiful and popular woman, vice under the mask of virtue, self-interest in the guise of friendship, and spite and malice springing up like a poisonous undergrowth beneath the words of elegant flattery or dainty compliment. I often wish I could throw a rose-colored mist of illusion over all these things, and still more earnestly do I wish I could in a single instance find myself mistaken. But alas! the fatal finger of the electric instinct within me points out unerringly the flaw in every human diamond, and writes "sham" across many a cunningly contrived imitation of intelligence and goodness. Still, the grief I feel at this is counterbalanced in part by the joy with which I quickly recognize real virtue, real nobility, real love, and when these attributes flash out upon me from the faces of human beings, my own soul warms, and I know I have seen a vision as of angels. The capability of Heliobas to foretell future events proved itself in his knowledge of the fate of the famous English hero, Gordon, long before that brave soldier met his doom. At the time the English government sent him out on his last fatal mission, a letter from Heliobas to me contained the following passage:
I see Gordon has chosen his destiny and the manner of his death. Two ways of dying have been offered him, one that is slow, painful, and inglorious, the other sudden and therefore sweeter to a man of his temperament. He himself is perfectly aware of the approaching end of his career. He will receive his release at Khartoum. England will lament over him for a while, and then he will be declared an inspired madman, who rushed recklessly on his own doom, while those who allowed him to be slain will be voted the wisest, the most just and virtuous in the realm.
This prophecy was carried out to the letter, as I fully believe certain things of which I am now informed will also be fulfilled. But though there are persons who pin their faith on Zadkiel, I doubt if there are any who will believe in such a thing as electric divination. The one is mere vulgar imposture, the other is performed on a purely scientific basis in accordance with certain existing rules and principles. Yet I think there can be no question as to which of the two the public en masse is likely to prefer. On whole, people do not mind being deceived. They hate being instructed, and the trouble of thinking for themselves is almost too much for them. Therefore, Zadkiel is certain to flourish for many and many a long day, while the lightning instinct of prophecy dormant in every human being remains unused and utterly forgotten except by the rare few. I have little more to say. I feel that those among my readers who idly turn over these pages, expecting to find a novel in the true acceptation of the word, may be disappointed. My narrative is simply an experience, but I have no wish to persuade others of the central truth contained in it, namely, the existence of powerful electric organs in every human being, which with proper cultivation are capable of marvellous spiritual force. The type is not yet ripe for this fact to be accepted. The persons connected with this story may be dismissed in a few words. When I joined my friend Mrs. Everard, she was suffering from nervous hysteria. My presence had the soothing effect Heliobas had assured me of, and in a very few days we started from Paris in company for England. She, with her amiable and accomplished husband, went back to the States a few months since to claim an immense fortune, which they are now enjoying as most Americans enjoy wealth. Amy has diamonds to her heart's content, and toilettes galore from Worth's, but she has no children, and from the tone of her letters to me, I fancy she would part with one at least of her valuable necklaces to have a small pair of chubby arms around her neck, and a soft little head nestling against her bosom. Raffaello Cellini still lives and works. His paintings are among the marvels of modern Italy for their richness and warmth of colour which, in spite of his envious detractors, is destined to last through ages. He is not very rich, for he is one of those who give away their substance to the poor and the distressed, but where he is known he is universally beloved. None of his pictures have yet been exhibited in England, and he is in no hurry to call upon the London critics for their judgment. He has been asked several times to sell his large picture, Lords of Our Life and Death, but he will not. I have never met him since our intercourse at Cannes, but I hear of him frequently through Heliobas, who has recently forwarded me a proof engraving of the picture L'Improvisatrice, for which I sat as model. It is a beautiful work of art, but that it is like me I am not vain enough to admit. I kept it, not as a portrait of myself, but as a souvenir of the man through whose introduction I gained the best friend I have. News of Prince Ivan Petrovsky reaches me frequently. He is a possessor of the immense wealth foretold by Heliobas. The eyes of society greedily follows his movements. His name figures conspicuously in the fashionable intelligence, and the magnificence of his recent marriage festivities was for some time the talk of the Continent. He has married the only daughter of a French duke, a lovely creature, as soulless and heartless as a dressmaker's stuffed model, but she carries his jewels well on her white bosom, and receives his guests with as much dignity as a well-trained major domo. These qualities suffice to satisfy her husband at present. How long his satisfaction will last is another matter. He has not quite forgotten Zara, for on every recurring Jour des Morts, or Feast of the Dead, he sends a garland or cross of flowers to the simple grave in Père Lachaise. Heliobas watches his career with untiring vigilance, nor can I myself avoid taking a certain interest in the progress of his fate. At the moment I write he is one of the most envied and popular noblemen in all the courts of Europe, and no one thinks of asking him whether he is happy. He must be happy, says the world. He has everything that is needed to make him so. Everything? Yes, all except one thing, for which he will long when the shadow of the end draws near. And now what else remains? A brief farewell to those who have perused this narrative, or a lingering parting word? In these days of haste and scramble, when there is no time for faith, is there time for sentiment? I think not. And therefore there shall be none between my readers and me, save this, a friendly warning. Belief in God, belief in all things noble, unworldly, lofty, and beautiful, is rapidly being crushed underfoot by what? By mere lust of gain. Be sure, good people, be very sure that you are right in denying God for the sake of man, in abjuring the spiritual for the material, before you rush recklessly onward. The end for all of you can be but death. And are you quite positive, after all, that there is no hereafter? Is it sense to imagine that the immense machinery of the universe has been set in motion for nothing? Is it even common reason to consider that the soul of man, with all its high musings, its dreams of unseen glory, its longings after the infinite, is a mere useless vapour, or a set of shifting molecules in a perishable brain? The mere fact of the existence of a desire clearly indicates an equally existing capacity for the gratification of that desire. Therefore I ask, would the wish for a future state of being, which is secretly felt by every one of us, have been permitted to find a place in our natures if there were no possible means of granting it? Why all this discontent with the present? Why all this universal complaint and despair and world weariness, if there be no hereafter? For my part, I have told you frankly what I have seen and what I know, but I do not ask you to believe me. I only say if you admit to yourselves the possibility of a future and eternal state of existence, would it not be well for you to inquire seriously how you are preparing for it in these wild days? Look at society around you and ask yourselves, whither is our progress tending? Forward or backward? Upward or downward? Which way? Fight the problem out. Do not glance at it casually, or put it away as an unpleasant thought, or a consideration involving too much trouble. Struggle with it bravely till you resolve it, and whatever the answer may be, abide by it. If it leads you to deny God and the immortal destinies of your own souls, and you find hereafter, when it is too late, that both God and immortality exist, you have only yourselves to blame. We are the arbiters of our own fate, and that fact is the most important one of our lives. Our will is positively unfettered. It is a rudder put freely into our hands, and with it we can steer wherever we choose. God will not compel our love or obedience. We must ourselves desire to love and obey, desire it above all things in the world. As for the electric origin of the universe, a time is coming when scientific men will acknowledge it to be the only theory of creation worthy of acceptance. All the wonders of nature are the result of light and heat alone, i.e., are the works of the electric ring I have endeavoured to describe, which must go on producing, absorbing, and reproducing worlds, suns and systems for ever and ever. The ring, in its turn, is merely the outcome of God's own personality, the atmosphere surrounding the world in which He has His existence, a world created by love, and for love alone. I cannot force this theory on public attention, which is at present claimed by various learned professors, who give ingenious explanations of atoms and molecules. Yet, even regarding these same atoms, the mild question may be put, where did the first atom come from? Some may answer, we call the first atom God. Surely it is as well to call him a spirit of pure light as an atom. However, the fact of one person's being convinced of a truth will not, I am aware, go very far to convince others. I have related my experience exactly as it happened at the time, and my readers can accept or deny the theories of Heliobas as they please. Neither denial, acceptance, criticism, nor incredulity can affect me personally, inasmuch as I am not Heliobas, but simply the narrator of an episode connected with him, and as such my task is finished. End of section 33. Read by Amy Gramour of Holton, Maine, 2012. amysmindtoyourmind.com. Section 34 of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Appendix. In publishing these selections from letters received concerning the romance, I am in honour bound not to disclose the names of my correspondents, and this necessary reticence will no doubt induce the incredulous to declare that they are not genuine epistles, but mere inventions of my own. I am quite prepared for such a possible aspersion, and in reply I can but say that I hold the originals in my possession, and that some of them have been read by my friend Mr. George Bentley, under whose auspices this book has been successfully launched on the sea of public favour. I may add that my correspondents are all strangers to me personally. Not one of them have I ever met. A few have indeed asked me to accord them interviews, but this request I invariably deny, not wishing to set myself forward in any way as an exponent of high doctrine in which I am as yet but a beginner and student. Author. Letter 1. Dear Madam, you must receive so many letters that I feel it is almost a shame to add to the number, but I cannot resist writing to tell you how very much your book, The Romance of Two Worlds, has helped me. My dear friend Miss F., who has written to you lately, I believe, first read it to me, and I cannot tell you what a want in my life it seemed to fill up. I have been always interested in the so called supernatural, feeling very conscious of depths in my own self and in others that are usually ignored. I have been reading as many books as I could obtain upon Theosophy, but though thankful for the high thoughts I found in them, I still feel a great want, that of combining this occult knowledge with my own firm belief in the Christian religion. Your book seemed to give me just what I wanted. It has deepened and strengthened my belief in and love to God, and has made the New Testament a new book to me. Things that I could not understand before seem clear in the light which your vision has thrown upon them, and I cannot remain satisfied without expressing to you my sincere gratitude. May your book be read by all who are ready to receive the high truths that it contains. With thanks, I remain, dear Madam, yours sincerely, M.S. Letter number 2. Madam, I am afraid you will think it very presumptuous of a stranger to address you, but I have lately read your book, A Romance of Two Worlds, and have been much struck with it. It has opened my mind to such new impressions, and seems to be so much what I have been groping for so long, that I thought if you would be kind enough to answer this, I might get a firmer hold on those higher things, and be at anchor at last. If you have patience to read so far, you will imagine I must be very much in earnest to intrude myself on you like this, but from the tone of your book, I do not believe you would withdraw your hand where you could do good. I never thought of or read of the electric force or spirit in every human being before, but I do believe in it after reading your book, and you have made the next world a living thing to me, and raised my feelings above the disappointments and trials of this life. Your book was put into my hands at a time when I was deeply distressed and in trouble about my future, but you have shown me how small a thing this future of our life is. Would it be asking too much of you to name any books you think might help me in this new vein of thought you have given me? Apologizing for having written, believe me yours sincerely, B.W.L. I answered to the best of my ability the writer of the above, and later on received another letter as follows: Forgive my writing to you again on the subject of your romance, but I read it so often and think of it so much, I cannot say the wonderful change your book has wrought in my life, and though very likely you are constantly hearing of the good it has done, yet it cannot be but the sweetest thing you can hear, that the seed you have planted is bringing forth so much fruit. The Bible is a new book to me since your work came into my hands. Letter 3. The following terribly pathetic avowal is from a clergyman of the Church of England. Madam, your book, The Romance of Two Worlds, has stopped me on the brink of what is doubtless a crime, and yet I had come to think it the only way out of impending madness. I speak of self-destruction, suicide, and while writing the word, I beg of you to accept my gratitude for the timely rescue of my soul. Once I believed in the goodness of God, but of late years the cry of modern scientific atheism, "There is no God," has rung in my ears till my brain has reeled at the desolation and nothingness of the universe. No good, no hope, no satisfaction in anything. This world only with all its mockery and failure, and afterwards annihilation. Could a God design and create so poor and cruel a jest? So I thought, and the misery of the thought was more than I could bear. I had resolved to make an end. No one knew, no one guessed my intent, till one Sunday afternoon a friend lent me your book. I began to read, and never left it till I had finished the last page. Then I knew I was saved. Life smiled again upon me in consoling colours, and I write to tell you that whatever other good your work may do, and is no doubt doing, you have saved both the life and reason of one grateful human being. If you will write to me a few lines, I shall be still more grateful, for I feel you can help me. I seem to have read Christ's mission wrong, but with patience and prayer it is possible to redeem my error. Once more thanking you, I am yours with more thankfulness than I can write. L.E.F. I lost no time in replying to this letter, and since then have frequently corresponded with the writer, from whose troubled mind the dark cloud has now entirely departed. And I may here venture to remark that the evils of modern scientific atheism are far more widely spread and deeply rooted than the majority of persons are aware of, and that many of the apparently inexplicable cases of self-slaughter on which the formal verdict, suicide during a state of temporary insanity, is passed, have been caused by long and hopeless brooding on the nothingness of the universe, which, if it were a true theory, would indeed make of creation a bitter, nay, even a senseless jest. The cruel preachers of such a creed have much to answer for. The murderer who destroys human life for wicked passion and wantonness is less criminal than the proudly learned yet egotistical and therefore densely ignorant scientist who, seeking to crush the soul by his feeble narrow-minded arguments and deny its imperishable nature, dares to spread his poisonous and corroding doctrines of despair through the world, draining existence of all its brightness, and striving to erect barriers of distrust between the creature and the Creator. No sin can be greater than this, for it is impossible to estimate the measure of evil that may thus be brought into otherwise innocent and happy lives. The attitude of devotion and faith is natural to humanity, while nothing can be more unnatural and disastrous to civilization, morality, and law than deliberate and determined atheism. Author. Letter 4. Dear Madam, I dare say you have had many letters, but I must add mine to the number to thank you for your book, The Romance of Two Worlds. I am deeply interested in the wonderful force we possess, all in a greater or lesser degree. Call it influence, electricity, or what you will. I have thought much on theosophy and psychical research, but what struck me in your book was the glorious selflessness inculcated and the perfect majesty of the Divinity clear throughout. No sweeping away of the Crucified One. I felt a better woman for the reading of it twice, and I know others too who are higher and better women for such noble thoughts and teaching. People for the most part dream away their lives. One meets so few who really believe in electrical affinity, and I have felt it so often and for so long. Forgive my troubling you with this letter, but I am grateful for your labor of love towards raising men and women. Sincerely yours, R.H. Letter 5. I should like to know if Marie Corelli honestly believes the theory which she enunciates in her book, The Romance of Two Worlds, and also if she has any proof on which to found that same theory. If so, the authoress will greatly oblige an earnest seeker after truth if she will give the information sought to. A.S. I sent a brief affirmative answer to the above note. The proof of the theories set forth in the romance is, as I have already stated, easily to be found in the New Testament. But there are those who do not and will not believe the New Testament, and for them there are no proofs of any existing spirituality in earth or heaven. Having eyes they see not, and hearing they do not understand. Author. Letter 6. Dear Madam, I have lately been reading with intense pleasure your Romance of Two Worlds, and I must crave your forbearance towards me when I tell you that it has filled me with envy and wonder. I feel sure that many people must have plied you with questions on the subject already, but I am certain that you are too earnest and too sympathetic to feel bored by what is in no sense idle curiosity, but rather a deep and genuine longing to know the truth. To some minds it would prove such a comfort and such a relief to have their vague longings and beliefs confirmed and made tangible, and as you know, at the present day, so-called religion, which is often a mere mixture of dogma and superstition, is scarcely sufficient to do this. I might say a great deal more, and weary your patience, which has already been tried, I fear, But may I venture to hope that you have some words of comfort and assurance out of your own experience to give me? With your expressed belief in the good influence which each may exert over the other, not to speak of a higher and holier incentive in the example of one, in whom you also believe, who bids us for his sake to bear one another's burdens, you cannot, I think, turn away in impatience from the seeking of a very earnest soul. Yours sincerely, B. D. I have received about 50 letters written in precisely the same tone as the above, all more or less complaining of the insufficiency of so called religion, which is often a mere mixture of dogma and superstition. And I ask, what are the preachers of Christ's clear message about that there should be such plaintive, eager, anxious souls as these, who are evidently ready and willing to live noble lives, if helped and encouraged ever so little? Shame on those men who presume to take up the high vocation of the priesthood for the sake of self-love, self-interest, worldly advancement, money, or position. These things are not among Christ's teachings. If there are members of the clergy who can neither plant faith nor consolation nor proper comprehension of God's infinite beauty and goodness in the hearts of their hearers, I say that their continuance in such sacred office is an offence to the Master whom they profess to serve. It must needs be that offences come, but woe to that man by whom the offence cometh. To such may be addressed the words, "Hypocrites! For ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. You neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in." Author. Letter 7. Madam, I hope you will not think it great presumption my writing you. My excuse must be that I so much want to believe in the great Spirit that makes for righteousness, and I cannot. Your book puts it all so clearly that if I can only know it to be a true experience of your own, it will go a long way in dispersing the fog that modern writings surround one with. Apologizing for troubling you, I am faithfully yours, C.M.E. Letter 8. Madam, I trust you will pardon the liberty I take in writing to you. My excuse must be the very deep interest your book, A Romance of Two Worlds, has excited in me. I of course understand that the story itself is a romance, but in reading it carefully it seems to me that it is a book written with a purpose. The electric creed respecting religion seems to explain so much in Scripture, which has always seemed to me impossible to accept blindly without explanation of any kind. And the theory that Christ came to die and to suffer for us as an example and a means of communication with God, and not as a sacrifice, clears up a point which has always been to me personally a stumbling block. I cannot say how grateful I shall be if you can tell me any means of studying this subject further, and trusting you will excuse me for troubling you, I am, Madam, yours truly, H.B. Once more I may repeat that the idea of a sacrifice to appease God's anger is purely Jewish, and has nothing whatever to do with Christianity according to Christ. He himself says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me." Surely these words are plain enough, and point unmistakably to a means of communication through Christ between the Creator and this world. Nowhere does the Divine Master say that God is so furiously angry that He must have the bleeding body of His own messenger, Christ, hung up before Him as a human sacrifice, as though He could only be pacified by the scent of blood. Horrible and profane idea, and one utterly at variance with the tenderness and goodness of our Father, as pictured by Christ in these gentle words, "Fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Whereas that Christ should come to draw us closer to God by the strong force of His own divinity, and by His resurrection prove to us the reality of the next life, is not at all a strange or ungodlike mission, and ought to make us understand more surely than ever how infinitely pitying and forbearing is the all-loving One, that He should, as it were, with such extreme affection, show us a way by which to travel through darkness unto light. To those who cannot see this perfection of goodness depicted in Christ's own words, I would say in the terse Oriental maxim, diving and finding no pearls in the sea, blame not the ocean, the fault is in thee. Author. Letter 9. Dear Madam, I have lately been reading your remarkable book, A Romance of Two Worlds, and I feel that I must write to you about it. I have never viewed Christianity in the broadly transfigured light you throw upon it, and I have since been studying carefully the four Gospels and comparing them with the theories in your book. The result has been a complete and happy change in my ideas of religion, and I feel now as if I had, like a leper of old, touched the robe of Christ and been healed of a long standing infirmity. Will you permit me to ask if you have evolved this new and beneficent lustre from the Gospel yourself, or whether some experienced student in mystic matters has been your instructor? I hear from persons who have seen you that you are quite young, and I cannot understand how one of your sex and age seems able so easily to throw light on what to many has been, and is still, impenetrable darkness. I have been a preacher for some years, and I thought the Testament was old and familiar to me, but you have made it a new and marvellous book, full of most precious meanings, and I hope I may be able to impart to those whom it is my duty to instruct something of the great consolation and hope your writing has filled me with. Believe me, gratefully yours, T.M. Letter 10. Madam, will you tell me what ground you have for the foundation of the religious theory contained in your book, A Romance of Two Worlds? Is it a part of your own belief? I am most anxious to know this, and I am sure you will be kind enough to answer me. Till I read your book I thought myself an agnostic, but now I am not quite sure of this. I do not believe in the Deity as depicted by the churches. I cannot. Over and over again I have asked myself, if there is a God, why should He be angry? It would surely be easy for Him to destroy this world entirely, as one would blow away an offending speck of dust, and it would be much better and braver for Him to do this than to torture His creation. For I call life a torture, and certainly a useless and cruel torture if it is to end in annihilation. I know I seem to be blasphemous in these remarks, yet if you only knew what I suffer sometimes! I long to believe you. You seem so certain of your creed, a creed so noble, reasonable, and humane, the God you depict so worthy of the adoration of a universe. I beg of you to tell me, do you feel sure of this beneficent, all-pervading love concerning which you write so eloquently? I do not wish to seem an intruder on your most secret thought. I want to believe that you believe, and if I felt this, the tenor of my whole life might change. Help me if you can. I stand in real need of help. You may judge I am very deeply in earnest, or I should not have written to you. Yours faithfully, A.W.L. Of such letters as these I have received enough to make a volume of themselves, but I think the 10 I have selected are sufficient to show how ardent and inextinguishable is the desire, or straining upward, like a flower to the light, of the human soul for those divine things which nourish it. Scarcely a day passes without my receiving more of these earnest and often pathetic appeals for a little help, a little comfort, a little guidance, enough to make one's heart ache at the thought of so much doubt and desolation looming cloud-like over the troubled minds of many who would otherwise lead not only happy but noble and useful lives. When will the preachers learn to preach Christ simply, Christ without human dogmas or differences? When shall we be able to enter a building set apart for sacred worship, a building of finest architectural beauty, glorious without and within, like the King's daughter of David's psalm, glorious with light, music, flowers, and art of the noblest kind? For art is God's own inspiration to men, and through it He should be served, there to hear the pure unselfish doctrine of Christ as He Himself preached it. For such a temple the time has surely come, a nook sacred to God, and untainted by the breath of Mammon, where we could adore our Creator in spirit and in truth. The evils of 19th century cynicism and general flippancy of thought, great evils as they are and sure prognostications of worse evils to come, cannot altogether crush out the divine flame burning in the few that are chosen, Though these few are counted as fools and dreamers, yet they shall be proved wise and watchful ere long. The signs of the times are those that indicate an approaching great upheaval and change in human destinies. This planet we call ours is in some respects like ourselves. It was born, it has had its infancy, its youth, its full prime, and now its age has set in, and with age the first beginnings of decay. Absorbed once more into the creative circle it must be, and when again thrown forth among its companion stars, our race will no longer inhabit it. We shall have had our day, our little chance; we shall have lost or won. Christ said, "This generation shall not pass away till all my words be fulfilled." The word generation thus used meaning simply the human race. We put a very narrow limit to the significance of the Saviour's utterance when we imagine that the generation He alluded to implied merely the people living in His own day. In the depths of His divine wisdom He was acquainted with all the secrets of the past and future. He had no doubt seen this very world peopled by widely different beings to ourselves, and knew that what we call the human race is only a passing tribe permitted for a time to sojourn here. What a strangely presumptuous idea is that which pervades the minds of the majority of persons, namely, that mankind, as we know it, must be the highest form of creation, simply because it is the highest form we can see. How absurd it is to be so controlled by our limited vision when we cannot even perceive the minute wonders that a butterfly beholds, or pierce the sunlit air with anything like the facility possessed by the undazzled eyes of an upward soaring bird. Nay, we cannot examine the wing of a common house fly without the aid of a microscope. To observe the facial expression of our own actors on the stage, we look through opera glasses. To form any idea of the wonders of the stars, we construct telescopes to assist our feeble and easily deluded sight. Yet we continue to parcel out the infinite gradations of creative force and beauty entirely to suit our own private opinions, and conclude that we are the final triumph of the Divine Artist's supreme intelligence. Alas! in very truth we are a sorry spectacle both to our soberly thinking selves and the higher powers, invited, as it were, to spend our life's brief day in one of God's gardens as His friends and guests, who certainly are not expected to abuse their host's hospitality, and ignoring Him call themselves the owners and masters of the ground. For we are but wanderers beneath the sun, a generation which must most surely and rapidly pass away to make room for another, and as the work of the universe is always progressive, that other will be of nobler capacity and larger accomplishment. So while we are here, let us think earnestly of the few brief chances remaining to us. They grow fewer every hour. On one side is the endless glorious heritage of the purely aspiring immortal spirit; on the other hand the fleeting mirage of this own present existence; and midway between the two, the swinging pendulum of human will, which decides our fate. God does not choose for us or compel our love. We are free to fashion out our own futures, but in making our final choice we cannot afford to waste one moment of our precious, unreturning time. Marie Corelli. End of Appendix, and end of A Romance of Two Worlds by Marie Corelli. Read by Amy Gramour of Holton, Maine, 2012. amysmindtoyourmind.com